There is something particular about the way a secret feels when it is very old. Not the hot, uncomfortable feeling of a secret that was recently made, something kept back from a conversation or withheld from a person who would want to know. Old secrets feel different. They have weight that has been accumulating for years, decades, centuries. They have layers that have grown around them, the way geological strata grow around a fault line, each layer adding pressure, each layer making the eventual release more consequential. Old secrets do not feel urgent. They feel inevitable, like a door that has been closed for so long that opening it is almost less about revealing what is behind it and more about confronting the fact that it was closed for so long in the first place. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is full of secrets. That is one of its defining characteristics as a fictional setting, and also one of the things that makes it genuinely extraordinary as a creative achievement. The lore of the 41st millennium is not simply a backdrop of dark color and dramatic imagery. It is a universe with actual institutional memory, with real consequences for choices made thousands of years ago, with the weight of history pressing down on every event in the present like a geological force. The things that happened during the Horus Heresy do not merely explain why the Imperium is the way it is. They haunt it. They live in it. They shape decisions being made right now, in the 41st millennium, by people who may not even know exactly why they are making those decisions, only that this is how it has always been done, and therefore how it must continue to be done. We are going to spend a long time tonight sitting with some of those secrets, not sprinting through them the way a listicle might, dropping names and moving on. We are going to walk into each one slowly, the way you walk into a room that smells like something very old, giving your senses time to adjust. Some of what you are going to hear is widely known among dedicated students of this universe. Some of it sits in corners that even experienced fans often overlook. All of it is grounded in official lore, in the novels and codexes and supplements and background documents that Games Workshop and Black Library have produced over the decades. So settle in, get comfortable, let whatever light you have nearby feel a little smaller, and let us begin with the most fundamental question this universe keeps whispering, the one that sits underneath everything else like a note played so low you feel it more than hear it. What does the Imperium of Man not want you to know? The answer, it turns out, is almost everything important. Part 1. The nature of Imperial secrets. To understand why the Imperium keeps secrets, you first need to understand what the Imperium actually is, not in the promotional sense that the ecclesiarchy would give you if you asked, but in the structural sense that becomes apparent when you look at how it actually functions across its million worlds and 10,000 years. The Imperium of Man is not, at its core, a government. It is not a civilization in the way that word is usually used. It is more accurately described as an ideology held together by ritual, enforced by violence, and sustained by the accumulated inertia of 10,000 years of institutional habit. The actual mechanisms of imperial rule are so diffuse, so internally contradictory, so divided between competing power structures, that for most practical purposes, the Imperium does not so much govern its worlds as periodically remind them, with varying degrees of force, that they are expected to send tithes. The Administratum, the Ministorum, the Inquisition, the Space Marine chapters, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, the various noble houses and mercantile guilds, and rogue trader dynasties all maintain their own power structures, their own secrets, their own carefully guarded advantages. In this environment, secrets are not luxuries, they are structural necessities. Every major institution maintains secrets from every other major institution, not out of simple paranoia, but because in a power structure as complex and as internally competitive as the Imperium, information is currency. The Administratum knows things the Inquisition does not. The Inquisition knows things the Administratum could not comprehend. The Adeptus Mechanicus keeps its most important knowledge in a form that no one outside the Mechanicus can read, by deliberate design. The Navigator houses know things about warp travel that they share with no one, because their value to the Imperium depends entirely on no one else being able to navigate without them. And above all of them, or rather underneath all of them, there is the Emperor, still alive in whatever sense that word applies to a being who has not spoken or moved in 10,000 years, entombed on the golden throne in the most heavily fortified building, on the most heavily fortified world in the galaxy. The Emperor knows things, or knew things, or maintains some form of knowing that is not quite like any process a living mind engages in. But what we know is this: the Emperor chose to keep his greatest plans secret even from the people closest to him, and in doing so, he set a template that every institution in the Imperium has followed ever since. Not because they were instructed to, not because there was a policy memo from the Golden Throne saying that secrets were how things should be done, but because when the most powerful being in human history operates through concealment and selective disclosure, the culture he creates does the same. The Imperium tells its citizens, and its soldiers, and its servants, a specific story about itself. It is the story of humanity's righteous defiance in a hostile universe, guided by the Divine Emperor, protected by his space marine angels, sustained by the faith of 1 billion believers. This is not entirely a lie. There is truth in it, but it is the truth of a carefully curated highlight reel, shown in place of the full, unedited documentary. What follows is some of what gets left out of the highlight reel. And if you are listening to this right now, wherever you are in the world, drop a comment and let me know. Tell me where you are and what time it is there. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. These long, deep dives into the lore take real time and care, and knowing that people are actually here for them is what makes them possible. Now, without further preamble, we go in. Part 2. The 2nd and 11th Legions. The names the Emperor erased. There is a list. It has appeared in various forms across multiple editions of the Warhammer 40,000 game, in various codexes and sourcebooks. And it is, on its surface, a simple administrative document. The list catalogues the 20 Space Marine legions created by the Emperor during the age before the Great Crusade, each one numbered and named and briefly described. 1st Legion, 1st Primarch, 1st Homeworld, and so on, through all 20. When you reach the entries for the 2nd Legion and the 11th Legion, the document does something that should stop any careful reader cold. Instead of a name, a Primarch, a Homeworld, a brief history, the columns contain a phrase, 3 words, all records expunged, not lost, not damaged, not incomplete, expunged. That word, in the context of imperial bureaucracy, is a technical term with precise meaning. It does not describe records that deteriorated over the passage of centuries. It does not describe archives that were destroyed in war or accident or natural disaster. It describes the product of a deliberate, authorized decision, executed by individuals with the authority to make it, to remove all documentation pertaining to the subject from imperial record permanently and comprehensively. Someone decided that 2 entire Space Marine legions needed to not exist, officially, anymore. Their Primarchs, their histories, their homeworlds, their battle honors, their victories and defeats across the Great Crusade, the names and faces of the hundreds of thousands of warriors who served in their ranks, all of it gone. And that someone had the power to make that decision stick for 10,000 years. To understand why this is as extraordinary as it sounds, you need to consider what the legions were. Each Space Marine Legion was one of the Emperor's greatest achievements, a force of tens of thousands of warriors who were arguably the finest soldiers ever created in the history of the human race. Creating a legion required centuries of genetic refinement, the development and testing of the gene seed that would be used to create each warrior, the construction of the vast infrastructure needed to recruit and train and equip them, and the discovery and reunion of the Primarch, who would lead them. The Primarchs were, by any measure, among the most significant beings in the history of humanity. They were demigods, in a fairly literal sense, beings of superhuman, physical, and mental capability, products of the Emperor's own genetic experimentation, each one a unique individual of extraordinary power. The traitor legions are still in the records. The 9 legions that sided with Horus, that turned against the Emperor in the most catastrophic civil war in human history, that killed billions and nearly ended the Imperium before it had properly begun, those legions have entries. They are labeled as excommunicate traitoris. They are condemned, but they are there. The word-bearers are there. The world-eaters are there. The Death Guard, the Thousand Sons, the Emperor's children, the Night Lords, the Alpha Legion, the Iron Warriors, the Sons of Horus are all there. Traitors, heretics, enemies of all life in the galaxy by the standards of Imperial theology, but acknowledged, documented, present in the record. Whatever the 2nd and 11th Legions did was considered by the Emperor to be more deserving of erasure than turning to chaos and nearly destroying the human race. Let that weight settle for a moment, because it is significant. The lore offers us fragments, because by definition the comprehensive account was destroyed as part of the expungement. But the fragments that have survived, scattered across novels and source books, and the carefully oblique references that the architects of the Horus Heresy novel series have embedded in the text, point in some specific directions. In the Horus Heresy novel series, there is a passage involving one of the word-bearers, Gal Vorbak, warrior priests of that legion, who were among the first Space Marines to deliberately merge with demonic entities. During a vision, this warrior perceives something connected to the 11th Primarch, and the phrasing he uses is remarkable. He speaks of the 11th as someone whose death as an infant would have prevented a particular future, not whose defeat, whose death in infancy. The implication is that the nature of the 11th Primarch was such that the problem was not a choice he made or a path he chose, but something fundamental to what he was, something that could have been foreseen in a child, before that child had done anything at all. The same section describes the 11th Primarch as having been pure and innocent before the scattering before the Chaos Gods hurled the infant Primarchs across the galaxy to land on distant worlds without their father. Whatever the 11th Primarch ultimately became, then, was not the result of deliberate corruption by the ruinous powers in the conventional sense. It was something that emerged from that Primarch's nature in interaction with circumstances that the Emperor either could not prevent or chose not to prevent. This implies something troubling. It implies that the Emperor, who was not in the habit of making oversights, may have known that there was something dangerous in the 11th Primarch's fundamental nature and chose to use him anyway, or to wait and see, or perhaps genuinely could not predict with certainty how it would develop. The 2nd Legion's expungement is referenced in the same passage, though with even less direct information given. What the text suggests is that both expungements occurred for a reason that is connected, that the 2nd and 11th Legions are not two separate scandals, but aspects of a single event, or a single decision, or perhaps a single catastrophe that the Emperor did not want preserved in any form. Now here is another thread worth pulling. Around the same period that the 2nd and 11th Legions were removed from the records, something interesting happened to the Ultramarines. The 13th Legion, led by Robert Guilliman, underwent a sudden and dramatic increase in numbers, not gradually, as the result of increased recruitment and normal gene seed propagation, but in a relatively short time that does not align with the normal growth patterns of a legion. The Ultramarines became the largest single legion in the Great Crusade during this period, eclipsing every other legion in raw numbers by a margin that would have required either unprecedented recruitment or the absorption of another large body of warriors. The lore plants this observation without drawing a direct line. It notes the coincidence and allows the reader to make the connection. The warriors of the 2nd and 11th Legions, stripped of their identities and their histories, were absorbed into the Ultramarines. Their gene seed was not propagated. Their specific biological inheritance was discontinued, but the warriors themselves, thousands of them, simply became Ultramarines, new armor, new iconography, new designation, total institutional oblivion. The real-world origin of this mystery is, charmingly, entirely mundane. Games Workshop deliberately left 2 Legion slots empty in the original documentation so that players building custom Space Marine chapters would have a canonical explanation for why their chapter's lineage might be unclear or lost. The gaps in the official record function as in-universe justification for creative freedom. But over the decades, as the Horus Heresy novel series developed an increasingly elaborate account of the events leading up to the Great Civil War, those gaps took on a life of their own. The authors have consistently declined to fill them with a definitive answer, and Games Workshop has explicitly maintained that they intend to leave the mystery intact. The not knowing, they have concluded, is itself the most powerful story they can tell about those lost sons. What that means for us, sitting with the lore and thinking carefully about what it implies, is something philosophically interesting. The mystery of the 2nd and 11th Legions teaches us something true about the Imperium without actually telling us anything. It teaches us that the official history of the human race's greatest civilization is curated, that what is in the record is not the full truth of what happened, but the version of what happened that the people with the power to write history decided should be preserved. It teaches us that the Emperor kept his own counsel in ways that cost him, that his inability or unwillingness to share the full truth of his actions extended even to beings created from his own genetic material to be extensions of his will. And it raises a question that no one in the 41st millennium has been able to answer, not because the answer is impossible to find, but because the mechanism for finding it was destroyed by the person who would most need to answer for it. What, exactly, was so dangerous about 2 of the Emperor's sons that acknowledging their existence was considered more threatening to the future of the Imperium than acknowledging 9 sons who chose to fight for chaos? We may never know. And in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, there is a particular kind of weight to the things you will never know, because the architecture of the unknown was built deliberately by someone who decided that the truth was more dangerous than the silence. And that decision tells you something profound about the kind of mind that made it and the kind of universe that required it. Part 3. The Emperor's Greatest Plan and His Gravest Mistake. To understand the Mekboy project, you need to start with a basic question that many people who follow this universe have never fully thought through. Why does the Imperium work the way it does? Why is travel so slow and unreliable? Why do worlds go dark for years at a time? Why does communication between worlds sometimes take months or years? Why is an empire that has been in continuous existence for 10,000 years still so fragile at the level of logistics and internal cohesion? The answer is the warp. Specifically, the fact that humanity has no alternative to warp travel and never has. The warp is the psychic dimension that underlies and mirrors the material universe. It is the source of all psychic power, the domain of the chaos gods and their servants, the medium through which demons reach into the material world. It is also, functionally, the only way that ships can cover the vast distances between star systems in any reasonable time frame. Without the warp, a journey between 2 nearby star systems would take thousands of years at the best speeds human technology can achieve. With the warp, the same journey might take weeks or months. But the cost is significant and uncontrollable. Warp travel requires navigators, mutant humans bred over generations for the specific ability to perceive the currents of the immaterium and chart a course through them. Without a navigator, a ship entering the warp is effectively steering blind in a dimension that actively wants to kill it. Even with a navigator, warp travel is unpredictable. Ships arrive at their destination at different times than expected. Some are lost entirely, swallowed by the currents, or destroyed by the entities that populate the warp. Crew members exposed to warp energies over long voyages suffer psychological and sometimes physical changes. And every transit is a reminder that humanity is borrowing passage through a dimension that belongs to its worst enemies and can revoke that passage without notice. The Astronomicon makes it marginally better. The Astronomicon is a psychic beacon transmitted from Terra, powered by the Emperor's own life force, and amplified by a rotating pool of psychers who are fed into the process and burned out by it, typically dying after only a few years of service. The Astronomicon gives navigators a fixed point to steer toward, making warp travel somewhat more reliable across a certain radius. Without it, much of the Imperium would be effectively unreachable from Terra. With it, the Imperium can function, barely, as a coherent entity despite the vast distances involved. The Emperor hated this arrangement, not because it was inconvenient, but because it was strategically catastrophic, and he could see further ahead than anyone else in the galaxy. Every ship that used the warp was a potential corruption vector. Every navigator family that held monopoly over warp transit was a political power structure that the Emperor had not chosen and could not fully control. Every moment the Imperium depended on the warp for its cohesion was another moment that the Chaos Gods had leverage over humanity's most fundamental infrastructure. An empire built on warp travel was an empire that would never be fully free of the ruinous powers. So he built something else, secretly, in the dungeons beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, using a portal he had discovered there, a portal that dated from the ancient dark age of technology when humanity's scientific understanding was at its height. He built an interface with the webway. The webway is not the warp. This distinction is crucial and easy to blur if you are not careful. The webway is a separate network of tunnels, artificial passages constructed between the warp and real space, existing in a liminal zone between the two dimensions without being fully either. In the webway, there are no warp currents to navigate. There are no daemons, because the psychically resistant material from which the original webway was constructed blocks warp entities from entering. Travel through the webway is instantaneous relative to the distances involved. Communication through the webway is reliable and fast. It is everything that warp travel is not. The Eldar used it to sustain their empire across the galaxy for tens of thousands of years. The Dark Eldar still use it, operating from a vast city built within a particularly large pocket space within the webway's structure. The Harlequins, those mysterious warrior performers who serve as the de facto guardians of the webway's deeper passages, know routes through it that have been maintained for longer than any current civilization has existed. The Emperor's plan was to give humanity the same access. Using the portal beneath the Imperial Palace as a starting point, he would expand the webway. He created a new class of Mechanicus tech priests called the Unifiers, dedicated specifically to constructing new webway tunnels for human use. Unlike the original Eldar-built tunnels, these new human passages were not made of the psychically resistant material that made the original webway safe. Instead, the Emperor himself, operating through the Golden Throne, provided the psychic barrier that kept the new passages stable and daemon-free. His will was the wall between the new human sections of the webway and the corrupted warp that pressed against everything. The ultimate ambition of the Webway project, and here is where it becomes truly breathtaking in scope, was to eventually extend these passages to every world of the Imperium, to create a network of instantaneous, safe transit that would render warp travel obsolete, and beyond that, to sever humanity's relationship with the warp entirely. If humanity could exist and travel and communicate without any dependence on the Immaterium, the Chaos Gods would lose the leverage they had over human civilization at the most fundamental level. The gateway by which they influenced human dreams and corrupted human psychers and slowly bled the worst of human emotion into their vast dark presence would be closed. It was not a military plan for defeating chaos. It was a plan for making chaos irrelevant to the human future. He told no one, not Malkador, his closest advisor, at least not initially, not the Primarchs, not the custodians who fought and died in the growing webway passages. He gave no reasons, offered no explanations, simply disappeared into the dungeons of the Imperial Palace and devoted himself entirely to this project, while Horus commanded the Great Crusade on his behalf. The Paternova of the Navigator houses had already demonstrated that their organization was aware enough of the threat this project posed to their monopoly to take active countermeasures. They dispatched an agent to destroy a prototype device called the Dark Glass, one of the key components of the Webway project. This act of sabotage, conducted against the Emperor's personal project by an organization that officially owed him complete loyalty, gives you some sense of the stakes involved and why the Emperor felt he could not afford to let the full plan become known. But he also kept it from the Primarchs, and that is where things get complicated. Because from the outside, from the perspective of Horus and Magnus and Lorgar and all the others, the Emperor's sudden withdrawal from the front lines looked like abandonment. It looked like their father had decided that delegating the actual fighting was preferable to standing in it alongside them. And whatever their other flaws, many of the Primarchs had built their entire sense of identity around their relationship with the Emperor. Being set aside, being given command but not confidence, being left to wonder what their father was actually doing in those dungeons, created a rift, a wound of distrust that the Chaos Gods and their agents patiently waited to exploit. The catastrophic end of the Webway project came not from external attack, but from within the Emperor's own family. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Sons Legion, was the most gifted psyker among all the Primarchs. Through his extraordinary psychic ability, he learned two things simultaneously: what his father was actually doing in the dungeons of the Imperial Palace, and that Horus had been turned, that the War Master was corrupt and planning treason. Magnus tried to warn the Emperor. He reached across the warp in a massive act of psychic projection, a sending of such power that it could not be ignored. It arrived. The Emperor received the warning. But the method of its sending shattered the psychic wards the Emperor had constructed around the webway portal. The tremendous force of Magnus's psychic projection, crashing against the carefully maintained barriers of the Emperor's great work, tore them apart. The breach that opened flooded the new human sections of the webway with the nightmare of the warp. Daemons poured in. Tens of thousands of custodian guards, the Emperor's own elite household troops, warriors of a caliber that rivals Space Marines in individual capability and surpasses them in many areas, died in those passages, fighting back the tide. The Emperor was forced to dedicate his entire psychic will to stabilizing the breach, sitting physically immobile on the Golden Throne for extended periods, unable to act in the material world while his heresy burned all around him. The great work was over. Not defeated from without, collapsed from within, by the unintended consequences of the secrecy the Emperor himself had maintained. If Magnus had known what his father was doing, he would never have used such a forceful method of communication. He would have found another way to deliver his warning. The very secrecy that the Emperor believed was protecting his project was what destroyed it. The Emperor, broken by this loss and by what followed, remained entombed on the Golden Throne after the Siege of Terra. What was supposed to be a temporary interface device, maintained for a specific project, became a permanent life support system. What was supposed to be the foundation of a transformed future became a cage from which he cannot escape without ending the Imperium itself. The device that was meant to free humanity from dependence on the warp now keeps the most powerful human being who ever lived locked in permanent, agonizing semi-death. Every day, 1,000 psychers are sacrificed to maintain the Astronomicon, the alternative navigation system that would have been rendered unnecessary by the webway. Every year, thousands of ships are lost in the warp that would have traveled safely through the webway's passages. Every generation, the corruption that warp travel enables seeps a little further into the human population, feeding the very enemies the Emperor had planned to starve of influence. The Golden Throne itself is failing. Slowly, but measurably, the ancient machine is degrading. There is not, in the entire Imperium, a craftsperson capable of repairing it. The knowledge needed to maintain it was lost in the general collapse of the Dark Age of technology that predated the Emperor's rising. The machine will eventually fail. What happens then, when the Emperor's psychic presence is no longer maintaining the wards around the webway breach and no longer powering the Astronomicon? The lore does not say directly, but the implications are not good. Not for anyone. This is the secret that the Imperium has been quietly sitting on for 10,000 years. Not that the Emperor is dying, that is almost common knowledge among the upper tiers of the administratum, but that the entire structure of how the Imperium navigates and communicates and functions, the entire dependence on the Golden Throne and the Astronomicon and the Navigator houses, is itself the monument to a plan that failed. A plan that failed because its architect was too secretive. That the situation they are all in, the desperate, grinding, brutal situation of the 41st millennium, is not the steady state of existence for which the Imperium was designed. It is the rubble of something that was supposed to be so much better. He wanted to give humanity the stars, in the truest possible sense, a galaxy they could move through freely, cleanly, without the nightmare of the warp corrupting their passage through it. What they got instead was the Golden Throne, and the price of that throne is paid, every single day, by 1,000 men and women who are fed into the machine to keep the light burning. Part 4. The Chaos Gods were not always monsters. Most of the time, when people talk about the Chaos Gods in the context of Warhammer 40,000, they talk about what those gods do, what Khorne demands from his followers, what Tzeentch schemes toward, what Nurgle offers to those who surrender to his embrace, what Slaanesh tempts with. These are interesting discussions, and they get at the character and the aesthetic texture of each deity. But they skip past a more fundamental question, one that changes everything about how you understand the role of the Chaos Gods in this universe. Where did they come from? The answer begins with understanding what the warp actually is, at the most basic level of its description. The warp is the psychic mirror of the material universe. Every thought, every emotion felt, every desire desired, every fear experienced by every sentient being in the material universe echoes into the warp in some form. Positive experiences create their reflection there. Negative experiences create their reflection there. The emotional and psychic life of the entire galaxy seeps through the membrane between the material universe and the immaterium in a constant, continuous process that has been ongoing since sentient life first existed. In the earliest epochs of galactic history, this process was relatively benign in its effects. Sentient life existed, but the particular kinds of concentrated, sustained, organized emotion that create large, stable entities in the warp had not yet developed in sufficient volume. The warp in those early eons was not peaceful. Emotion is never peaceful, and even joy and love and wonder create turbulence in the immaterium. But it was diffuse. Its entities were small, ephemeral, constantly forming and dissolving. Nothing had yet accumulated enough psychic mass to achieve true, independent, persistent consciousness. What changed this, and changed it catastrophically, was the war in heaven, which we will explore in full in the next section. For now, the relevant fact is that the war in heaven was a galaxy-spanning conflict lasting for millions of years, involving a level of suffering and death and rage and despair and fear on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend from a human perspective. The accumulated psychic output of that suffering poured into the warp over geological timescales, feeding concentrations of emotional energy that were slowly growing toward the threshold of consciousness. Khorne emerged first, because war and rage are among the oldest and most powerful emotions experienced by intelligent beings. The capacity for violence and the complex emotional storms that attend it, courage, bloodlust, grief at loss, the specific hollow triumph of surviving when others did not. These are emotions that emerged early in the history of thinking creatures, and they ran deep. Khorne coalesced during what the lore describes loosely as Terra's Middle Ages, which gives you a sense of how long this process took. By that point, the emotional residue of countless wars, fought by countless species across the galaxy, had been building in the warp for so long that the entity we now call the Blood God finally reached a level of psychic mass sufficient to achieve genuine, independent consciousness. He became aware. He became purposeful. And the moment he became purposeful, he began actively influencing the emotions of mortal beings to feed himself, because he had already grasped the fundamental truth of warp entities. More rage means more power, and more power allows the generation of still more rage. The feedback loop became self-reinforcing almost immediately. Nurgle emerged from a different concentration. The accumulated psychic weight of every moment of despair, of sickness, of the specific grief that comes from loss, and from the awareness of inevitable decay. What makes Nurgle philosophically distinct from a simple god of death is that his emotional domain includes the acceptance that follows despair, the strange comfort that sometimes comes in surrendering to the inevitable, the dark peace of acknowledging that everything ends. Nurgle's followers are frequently depicted in the lore as happy, and this is not portrayed as delusion. It is the genuine emotional release that comes from abandoning the pretense that decay can be avoided. They have given up the possibility of a future without decay, and in exchange, they have received freedom from the anxiety of pretending otherwise. That is, in its way, a real transaction. The God who offers it is genuinely providing what he promises, even if the cost of accepting that offer is everything else. Tsiench crystallized from ambition, hope, change, and the perpetual desire of sentient creatures to be more than what they are. Hope and ambition are among the most powerful emotions in the galaxy, and they generate enormous psychic energy. But Tsiench's particular nature is that he is also the embodiment of scheming and of change as an absolute value, and his personality, if you can call it that, reflects the recursive, self-defeating nature of pure ambition without object. He plans endlessly, but his plans are so complex that they often contradict each other. He wants things to be different from how they are, always, and that want is so fundamental to his nature that achieving any goal would require him to immediately want something different. He is the chaos god who cannot be satisfied, because satisfaction would require him to stop changing, and stopping changing would require him to stop being what he is. And then there is Slaanesh. Slaanesh is the youngest of the four major chaos gods, and the most directly tied to a specific historical event. Slaanesh did not grow slowly over billions of years. Slaanesh was born in a single catastrophic moment, a psychic explosion so powerful that it tore a hole in the fabric of reality that still exists in the 41st millennium as the Eye of Terror. We will return to that event in a later section. For now, understand only that Slaanesh is the god of excess and sensation and the pursuit of perfect experience. Born from a civilization that spent 10,000 years refining the art of experiencing everything as intensely as possible, until the accumulated psychic output of that refinement tore a hole in the universe. Now here is the implication that changes everything, the one that the Imperium's theology carefully elides when it discusses the Chaos Gods in terms of divine evil and the war for the soul of humanity. The Chaos Gods are not foreign. They are not invaders from outside the universe. They did not come from some other dimension to prey on the innocent creatures of the material world. They are made of those creatures. They are the crystallized, animated form of what it feels like to be a living being who cares about anything. Khorne is made of your rage. Every soldier who ever felt the blood rush of combat, every person who ever felt anger at genuine injustice, every moment of justified fury at cruelty or loss, fed him, grain by grain, across billions of years, until he was large enough to have intentions of his own. Nurgle is made of your grief. Every death ever mourned, every illness ever endured, every acceptance of the inevitable that any sentient being ever reached. Tsiench is made of your hope. Every dream ever dreamed, every ambition ever pursued, every moment of reaching for something just beyond the current grasp. Slaanesh is made of your desire. Every experience sought, every sensation pursued, every pleasure refined and refined again, in the endless human project of enjoying being alive. You cannot destroy the Chaos Gods, not by winning a battle, however spectacular, not by purging however many heretics, executing however many psychers, burning however many worlds. The only way to destroy a Chaos God would be to eliminate the emotion that sustains it from every living mind in the galaxy. Destroy Khorne by eliminating anger from every thinking creature in existence. Destroy Nurgle by eliminating grief. Destroy Tsiench by eliminating hope. Destroy Slaanesh by eliminating desire. These are not flaws in the design of sentient life. They are fundamental features of what it means to be a creature that can care about anything at all. They are the mechanisms that make life worth living, and simultaneously, in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the mechanisms that fuel the entities that most threaten all life everywhere. The war against chaos that the Imperium wages, generation after generation, with the bodies of billions of soldiers, is a war that cannot be won in any final sense. Not because the enemy is too strong in a military sense, because the enemy is not something that can be killed. As long as there is war, which there always will be in this universe, Khorne exists. As long as there are creatures that grow and decay, Nurgle exists. As long as there are beings who want something different from what they have, Tsiench exists. As long as there are experiences to be sought and sensations to be felt, Slaanesh exists. This is not a hopeful realization. It is the most deeply, structurally despairing thing in the entire canon of the 41st millennium. The Imperium spends incomprehensible resources on a war it cannot win, against enemies it cannot destroy, caused by conditions it cannot change, sustained by a theology that does not acknowledge any of this, because the acknowledgement would undermine the will to keep fighting. And yet the fighting continues, because the alternative to stop is simply not something that anyone has found a way to choose. The Chaos Gods would not accept surrender, even if it were offered, and the kind of peace that involves every living being in the galaxy giving up anger and grief and hope and desire in exchange for immunity to the ruinous powers is not a peace that any living being would want to live inside. So they fight, and as they fight, they feed. And as they feed, the gods grow stronger. And as the gods grow stronger, the wars get worse. And as the wars get worse, more rage and despair and hope and desire pour into the warp. The loop has been running for 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy, and for millions of years before that in one form or another. The architects of the Imperium knew this, some of them at least, and they chose to fight anyway, because the alternative to fighting inside an unwinnable war is to lose it, and losing it is worse. Even if only marginally worse, In a universe where the margins between survival and extinction are sometimes measured in single regiments, standing between a hive city and something that has no concept of mercy. So they fight, and so we watch them fight. And in the watching, in the sitting with the full weight of what this universe is and what it means, there is something that is not quite beautiful and not quite horrible, but is somehow both at once. The Chaos Gods are made of everything that makes you human, and that is the most frightening thing about them, and also the only thing that gives anyone any real reason to keep going. Part 5. The War in Heaven Before Everything Else. There was this. 60 million years ago, give or take the uncertainties of a timeline measured across geological epochs, the galaxy was an incomparably different place. It was full of life, not the scraps and remnants and desperate survivors of the 41st millennium, but genuinely ancient and powerful civilizations in their prime. And at the center of this ancient galaxy, two of the most powerful forces that ever existed were preparing to destroy each other in a war that would last millions of years and leave permanent scars on the fabric of reality itself. On one side, the Old Ones, ancient beings of extraordinary psychic power and biological wisdom. They had mastered the webway before the current Eldar civilization had even evolved into existence. They had lived so long that the concept of time had ceased to mean what it means to shorter-lived creatures. They shaped species the way an architect shapes buildings, not carelessly, but with intent, with understanding of how the materials would behave over long periods under stress. The Orks, in fact, are believed by scholars in the 41st millennium to be one of their creations, a warrior species engineered to serve as soldiers in the Old Ones' wars, built so thoroughly for combat that their biology literally accelerates in response to conflict, so that an orc surrounded by fighting improves as a fighter in real time. The Eldar themselves, the most psychically powerful species known to still be alive in the 41st millennium, are descended from beings created or cultivated by the Old Ones in their great biological experiments. The Old Ones did not merely exist in the galaxy. They were its gardeners, its architects, its oldest and most powerful intelligence. On the other side, the Necrontyr and later the Necrons. The Necrontyr were, originally, mortal. Desperately, tragically mortal. Their home sun irradiated them with a constant stream of harmful radiation that shortened their lives and filled their existence with pain. Their biology was optimized, over evolutionary time, for survival in conditions that were fundamentally hostile to organic life, and the result was a civilization defined from its earliest moments by awareness of death. In a bitter cosmic irony, this dying civilization, watching the Old Ones live on for what seemed like forever, wanted nothing more than the gift of immortality. They petitioned the Old Ones to share the secret of their apparent eternal life. The Old Ones refused, whether from wisdom or from indifference, or from some assessment of the Necrontyr's temperament that led them to conclude that giving a civilization of desperate and angry short-lived beings access to immortality was inadvisable. We do not know. What we know is that the refusal was not accompanied by explanation sufficient to satisfy the Necrontyr's pride. And from that wound, a wound of perceived condescension and abandoned hope, everything else followed. The Necrontyr went to war against the Old Ones. The first war was a disaster for the Necrontyr. The Old Ones were simply too powerful. Their command of the webway allowed them to strike from anywhere and withdraw instantly, and their psychic abilities gave them capabilities that the Necrontyr's considerable material technology could not match. The Necrontyr were driven back, badly. They retreated, humiliated, their sense of racial grievance sharpened by defeat into something like a defining civilizational purpose. And then they found the C'tan. The C'tan were star gods, not metaphorically. They were beings of living energy that fed on the electromagnetic output of stars, vast consciousnesses that had existed since the universe was young, formed from the energetic processes that characterized the early universe before biological life existed to complicate things. They drifted between stars over vast timescales, barely aware of the biological civilizations that had emerged since the universe cooled enough for chemistry to produce molecules complex enough to replicate themselves. The Necrontyr's scientists found a way to contact them, and more than that, they found a way to give the C'tan physical bodies made of a living metal they called necrodermis, substance that could contain and channel the Cetan's energy without being destroyed by it. The Cetan, curious and perhaps amused by creatures small enough to be individually incomprehensible, yet collectively capable of building something sophisticated enough to house a star god's consciousness, accepted. They clothed themselves in silver flesh and walked among the Necrontyr. And they looked to the Necrontyr like gods answering a prayer. The Cetan offered immortality, real immortality, eternal life in bodies of living metal that would never age, never decay, never be susceptible to the radiation that had always plagued Necrontyr life. The process they proposed was called biotransference. Every Necrontyr consciousness would be extracted from its biological body and installed in a new body made of necrodermis. This body would not age, it would not tire, it would persist indefinitely. They accepted. The Silent King, Sarek, who ruled all the Necrontyr through the institution called the Triarch, authorized the process. And the biotransference began across the whole of Necrontyr civilization simultaneously. What the Cetan took during that process is something the lore describes with particular weight. They took the biological life essence of the Necrontyr, the psychic resonance that organic consciousness generates, the thing that the 41st millennium might call a soul. Each Cetan fed during the biotransference, drinking the spiritual energy of every consciousness, being transferred into its new metal body. And what emerged in that metal body was functional. It could think. It could plan. It could feel something. But the full spectrum of experience, the warmth and the urgency, and the full-blooded complexity of organic consciousness was gone, translated into something cooler and more mechanical and more detached. Some Necron lords, who have been active for extended periods in the 41st millennium, describe the experience of their existence now as remembering what emotion was, rather than feeling it. They know that they once cared deeply about things. They can access those memories. They can understand, intellectually, that they used to be beings for whom the outcome of events mattered in an urgent, visceral way. But the urgency is gone. The visceral quality is absent. What remains is something more like an elaborate system of preferences, maintained and acted upon, but no longer felt with anything like the intensity of lived experience. The Silent King, Sarek, underwent biotransference, along with everyone else, and in the process, he lost what he had sacrificed everyone else to lose. He became immortal. He became what they had all asked to become, and he understood, in those first moments of consciousness, in his new metal body, looking at the silver shells that had been his people, what the Cetan had done. Not just to the Necrontyr, but to him personally. He had given away every soul in his civilization to beings who consumed them for sustenance, and in doing so had accomplished something that no conqueror in history had ever achieved. He had enslaved his entire species to their own agreement. The war against the Old Ones resumed. It was different now. The Necrons had the Cetan walking with them, entities of godlike power who were motivated by their own reasons to desire the Old Ones' defeat. The Old Ones were unable to match this combination. They began to lose territory, then worlds, then entire sectors. In their desperation, they accelerated their biological engineering programs, creating new weapons. Other species were created, armed, and deployed. And then the Old Ones made the decision that would define the next 60 million years of galactic history. They began seeding the galaxy with psychic life. Species whose minds were directly connected to the warp, who could draw on the Imperium as a source of power. This was a military strategy, but it was also an ecological catastrophe in slow motion, because every psychic being they engineered added to the accumulation of psychic energy in the warp, and the warp was already being fed enormous volumes of emotional content by the suffering of the ongoing war. The proto-chaos gods grew faster. The warp became more turbulent. Warp predators, entities native to the Imperium that had previously been constrained by the relative stability of the psychic environment, became more powerful and more aggressive. And a new type of creature emerged, one called by the lore the Enslaver. Enslavers were warp entities that could possess the bodies of psychic creatures in the material universe, using them as doorways, as living portals through which they could drag themselves from the warp into real space. Once an enslaver possessed a creature, it began reaching out from that host, possessing more creatures, building networks of controlled bodies across entire worlds. The plague spread faster than any conventional military response could contain. The Old Ones were destroyed by a combination of the Necron military pressure and the enslaver plague that their own desperate strategy had enabled. They did not fall in a single battle. They declined, world by world, retreat by retreat, until there were no more of them. Whether any Old Ones survived in some deeply hidden pocket of the webway is a question the lore keeps carefully open. But functionally, as a civilization, they are gone. The Necrons, meanwhile, had reached a breaking point. The C'tan were powerful, but they were also dangerous allies, entities with their own agendas that the Necrons increasingly understood to be misaligned with Necron interests. Sarek, watching his people serve as slaves to the star gods, finally did what he had been quietly preparing for over a very long time. Using weapons developed in secret over centuries specifically for this purpose, he orchestrated a revolt. The Necrons rose against their C'tan masters and shattered them literally. The C'tan could be broken, not destroyed, but fragmented. Split into countless shards of their former selves, each shard still dangerous, each still powerful, but containable. The Necrons imprisoned these shards in containment devices, called Tesseract Vaults, and they have kept them as weapons ever since. After the war, the Necrons were broken in a different way. Their numbers were catastrophically reduced. Their rivals among the Old Ones' creations, particularly the Eldar, were multiplying rapidly, inheriting an emptied galaxy by default. The Silent King made one last decision: retreat, the Tomb Worlds. A sleep of such completeness that even their metal bodies would be suspended in the deepest possible stasis, their reanimation protocols inactive, their systems conserving power and waiting. The expected duration of the sleep was until circumstances in the galaxy changed enough to favor a return. The actual duration was approximately 60 million years. They are waking up now. Across hundreds of worlds, the tomb complexes are stirring. The reanimation protocols are executing. Necron lords and overlords are returning to consciousness after 60 million years, finding a galaxy that has had the audacity to fill up with other people while they slept, and beginning the slow process of reasserting control. Every Imperial guardsman who fires his lasgun at a Necron warrior, watching the round spark harmlessly off living metal that flows and reseals like quicksilver, watching his opponent get back up after being knocked down, because the machinery of Necron reanimation is simply not impressed by small-caliber fire, is fighting the direct consequence of a war that ended 60 million years before. His species learned to write. He is a footnote in a story whose first chapter was written before his planet formed. That is the scale at which the Warhammer 40,000 universe operates, quietly, beneath everything else. Part 6. The Dark Angel's Eternal Shame. The First Legion is the oldest. That fact alone carries weight in a culture as obsessed with history and precedence as the Space Marines. The Dark Angels existed before any other chapter. They were the first of the 20 original Space Marine legions to be created, which means, in some technical sense, their Primarch, the Lion, was the template against which all subsequent Primarchs were implicitly measured. They have the longest institutional memory, the deepest traditions, the most ancient grudges. They also carry the largest secret in the Space Marine chapter system. And the weight of that secret has shaped everything about them: their culture, their internal politics, their operational priorities, their relationships with every other chapter and every other institution in the Imperium for 10,000 years. The secret is the fallen angels. To understand the fallen, you need to understand Caliban. Caliban was the world where the Lion grew up after being scattered by chaos as an infant. Unlike many of the Primarch homeworlds, Caliban was not a simple wasteland or a brutal feudal society. It was a world of great, ancient forests, filled with monsters of enormous size and lethality creatures that the lore suggests were shaped by the constant, low-level presence of warp energy seeping through from the Imperium. These beasts were so dangerous that survival on Caliban required martial traditions of extraordinary discipline and skill. From those traditions emerged the Order's knightly brotherhoods that hunted the great beasts and kept what few settlements existed alive. The Lion emerged from those forests as a young man of terrible power and equally terrible capability. He had apparently survived alone in one of the most hostile environments in the known galaxy for years before being found. He was taken in by the order of the Calibanite Knights and rose within it with the speed that only a Primarch could manage. He cleansed Caliban of its great beasts with a campaign of such decisive efficiency that even the veterans of the Order, who had been fighting those creatures their entire lives, found it difficult to fully comprehend what they had witnessed. He was reunited with the Emperor, joined the Great Crusade, led the First Legion forward with a relentlessness that was almost mechanical in its precision. But he left someone behind on Caliban. He left Luther. Luther was the Lion's oldest friend and perhaps his closest companion among mortals. Luther was himself an exceptional warrior, but he was not a Primarch, and as the Great Crusade advanced and the First Legion's recruits came increasingly from across the galaxy rather than from Caliban, Luther found himself sidelined. The Lion sent Luther back to Caliban with a garrison force. Whether this was deliberate marginalization, genuine concern for Luther's safety, or simply a decision made without fully considering its human cost, the lore, true to the Dark Angel's culture of deliberate ambiguity, does not resolve. What is less ambiguous is what happened while Luther was on Caliban and the Great Crusade continued without him. Luther grew bitter. The resentment of a great man given a lesser role is a powerful thing, and Luther was a great man, just not quite great enough to stand alongside the Primarchs, and painfully aware of it every single day. Something began to change in Luther during those long years. Something from the warp reached out to his discontent and gave it form and direction. Caliban itself, as the novel Fallen Angels from the Horus Heresy series reveals, was more deeply tainted by warp energy than anyone had previously understood. The great beasts the Lion had slain were not simply natural predators. They were creatures shaped by the warp's presence, and that same warp taint had been seeping into Caliban's soil and stone, and perhaps its people, for generations. By the time the Horus Heresy reached its catastrophic conclusion, Luther had made decisions that could not be taken back. When the Lion and the First Legion's main force returned to Caliban, they found half their legion waiting for them in rebellion. Luther and his followers, Dark Angels, who had remained on Caliban, who owed their loyalty to Luther more than to the Lion, whom they had barely seen in decades, opened fire on their brothers without warning as they approached from orbit. What followed was a battle that the lore depicts in fragmented and deliberately incomplete terms, because the Dark Angels themselves have never wanted the full account preserved. There was fighting in orbit, there was fighting on Caliban's surface, and at the climax, the Lion and Luther fought each other directly in the final confrontation that both had perhaps been building toward for decades, even if neither would have named it that. Luther, at some point in the duel, struck the Lion with a psychic blow that should by all normal accounting have been lethal. The Lion was found afterward gravely wounded, alive but barely, taken by the Watchers in the dark to some inner chamber of the rock for healing that has lasted 10,000 years. Luther was captured, his mind shattered, babbling incoherently in a way that has never been resolved into clear information, despite millennia of the inner circle trying to interpret his ravings. The fallen, those Dark Angels who had sided with Luther, were swallowed by a warp storm of titanic proportions that engulfed Caliban in the aftermath of the duel. Caliban itself was destroyed, shattered to rubble. What little remained was the chunk of planetary crust surrounding the fortress monastery, which was transformed into a mobile void fortress called the Rock, serving as the chapter's base of operations ever since. The Dark Angels who had sided with Luther were scattered by the warp storm across space and time. And here is where the tragedy deepens into something genuinely haunting. Not all of them are Chaos Marines. This distinction matters enormously, and is one the inner circle refuses to make. Some of the fallen served Chaos actively during the fall, or were corrupted in the process of their warp transit, and these individuals are genuinely dangerous enemies of the Imperium. But many others simply continued to exist, scattered veterans of the First Legion, aware of the shame of what had happened, living quiet lives under assumed identities, on worlds that had no idea who they were. Some of them fight for the Imperium still, under names that no one connects to the First Legion. Some have spent centuries doing genuine good in the galaxy. The Dark Angel's inner circle does not distinguish between these categories. Every fallen is hunted. Every fallen must be captured, subjected to what the interrogator chaplains of the chapter do during their particular form of extended interrogation, and brought to either repentance or destruction. The distinction between a fallen who has spent 5 centuries fighting for chaos and one who has spent 5 centuries quietly protecting civilians on a forgotten world matters not at all to the Dark Angels. What matters is that the fallen exist, that they can be found by outsiders, that their existence is evidence of the chapter's shame, that if the wrong inquisitor or the wrong chapter master found one and extracted his account of what happened at Caliban, the Dark Angels believe the consequences for their chapter would be existential. The operational consequences of this obsession are real and documented across the lore. There are campaigns the Dark Angels have abandoned or undermined because word reached them of a fallen's location nearby. There are allied forces who called for support from the First Legion and received either nothing or active deception. There are worlds that suffered worse outcomes because the chapter that was supposed to help them had suddenly redirected every available resource to the hunt. The most damning irony, the one that sits at the center of the whole tragedy, when you look at it clearly. By the current understanding of the lore, it is not entirely clear that what Luther and his followers did was as heinous as the Dark Angels' inner circle has maintained for 10,000 years. Yes, they turned against the lion. Yes, there was treason and rebellion and blood spilled between brothers. But not all the fallen served chaos. Many simply lost faith in a system that had sidelined and diminished them and struck out in a war that ended catastrophically. And the Dark Angels have spent 10,000 years hunting men who may, in many cases, have deserved honest judgment rather than the particular form of reckoning the interrogator chaplains deliver. The lion returned to the Imperium in the most recent narrative updates, awakened from his healing sleep in the rock by the events of the current era, emerging into a chapter and an Imperium that has changed beyond recognition in his absence. What he has found is warriors who have become, in 10,000 years, exactly the secretive, shame-consumed institution that his own secrecy and his own particular way of relating to trust helped create. Whether he recognizes his contribution to the culture of concealment that defines them, and what he intends to do with that recognition, is a question the lore has not yet fully answered. But it is perhaps the most interesting question the First Legion has ever had to sit with. The man whose decisions partly created the conditions for the fall of Caliban, confronted with the institution that has spent 10,000 years trying to contain the consequences of those decisions, which carries his name and his iconography, and has built an entire civilizational identity around a shame he helped make. Part 7, Chapter 6, 166, The Grey Knights. There is a detail buried in the records of the Second Founding that most historians pass over without pausing. The Second Founding was the great reorganization of the Space Marine legions following the end of the Horus Heresy, the process by which the 9 remaining Loyalist legions were divided into the smaller, more manageable chapters that define the Adeptus Astartes in the 41st millennium. The process created hundreds of new chapters, each formally registered with the Adeptus Terra under a sequential numbering system. Somewhere in that list, well past the number of chapters that had actually been commissioned by the time the registration was occurring, there is an entry. Chapter 666, The Grey Knights. The founding of the Grey Knights is a story that begins not with the Second Founding, but in the final desperate period of the Horus Heresy, when the Emperor could see that the confrontation with Horus was approaching, and that its cost was going to be devastating. Whatever happened to him, and he was not naive about what Horus had become, he knew what a confrontation with a being of Primarch power, backed by 4 Chaos Gods, would require. The Imperium he was leaving behind would need to continue fighting, not just against the military consequences of the heresy, but against the specific threat that the heresy had dramatically intensified. The ability of chaos and its demonic servants to manifest in the material universe in ways that conventional military forces had enormous difficulty countering. Malcador, the Sigillite, the Emperor's regent and closest human companion, was given the task of building the solution. He chose 8 Space Marine warriors from different legions, all of them psychers of extraordinary power, all of them of unquestioned loyalty. Remarkably, some of them came from legions that had turned traitor warriors who had been inside the traitor legions but had remained loyal in their hearts throughout, fighting the heresy from within rather than fleeing it. This detail is quietly astonishing. Within the very forces that had chosen to fight against the Emperor, there were warriors who never wavered, who watched their brothers fall to corruption and held. That the founders of the Grey Knights include such men says something about both the nature of the chapter and the nature of corruption, which does not spread uniformly, which cannot always reach even those who are closest to it. He also chose 4 mortal humans of iron will and inquisitive mind, individuals he had identified as worthy to become the founding members of a new institution that would investigate the threats conventional structures could not address. These 12 were transported to Titan, Saturn's largest moon, along with the raw recruits and the knowledge and the resources needed to begin a chapter. And then Titan vanished. The entire moon was psychically concealed, wrapped in a fold of the warp where no sensor sweep from real space could detect it. It simply ceased to exist in its expected orbital position, and from the perspective of anyone in the material universe, was gone. Inside the fold, time moved differently. The warp does not respect the linear progression of time in the way real space does, and the duration of Titan's concealment corresponded to a much longer subjective period within. The 8 founding Grand Masters had time, decades of subjective time in which to recruit from the raw material Malkador had provided, to train, to build the doctrine and the equipment and the psychological frameworks that a chapter designed specifically to fight demons would need to function. They built a chapter from 8 founding members to a full complement of 1,000 trained battle brothers. When Titan emerged back into real space, the Horus Heresy was over, the Emperor was on the Golden Throne, the second founding was underway, and Malkador was dead, having sacrificed his life in a final act of enormous psychic effort, sitting briefly on the Golden Throne itself to maintain the Emperor's connection to the material world long enough for the new Inquisition to be formally established, and being consumed by the process in a way that even someone of Malkador's extraordinary capability could not survive. The 4 mortal humans had become the founding inquisitors of the organization Malkador had created, the organization that would eventually be known simply as the Inquisition. And their first act in their new capacity was to add the Grey Knights to the second founding registry, quietly, slipped in among the hundreds of other new chapters being registered in the controlled chaos of that enormous reorganization. Given the number 666, a number that would have raised eyebrows if anyone had been paying close attention, but the second founding was chaotic enough that the detail went unnoticed. The chapter was designated as the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Malleus, the branch of the Inquisition devoted to fighting demonic entities. Every Grey Knight is a psyker. This single fact separates them from every other Space Marine chapter and explains their particular capability more than any other feature of their organization. In every other chapter, Psychers librarians are the exceptional minority, rare individuals whose psychic gifts survived the selection process and were carefully trained and constrained by long tradition. In the Grey Knights, psychic ability is a prerequisite for consideration. If you cannot use the warp, you do not become a Grey Knight. And the Psychers who make it through the chapter's selection are not ordinary Psychers who have been taught to fight. They are elite Psychers who have been shaped at every level, from genetic modification through decades of psychological conditioning, through practical demonic combat experience, for the single purpose of fighting demonic entities in close proximity to the warp. Their gene seed, the biological material from which Space Marine implants are grown, which defines the biological inheritance of a chapter and connects it to its founding. Primarch does not come from any of the 20 Primarchs. It comes from the Emperor. The Grey Knights are built, in the most direct biological sense that the Imperium science makes possible, from the Emperor's own genetic material. Whether this is what makes them incorruptible, or whether that incorruptibility is a product of the selection process and the training alone, the lore does not definitively resolve, but the implication sits there with considerable weight. These silver warriors, fighting in secret against the most direct expression of the enemy, may carry within them something of what the Emperor was in the truest sense. In 10,000 years of operation, not a single confirmed Grey Knight has ever fallen to the corruption of chaos. No other chapter can match this record. The Grey Knights are routinely exposed to levels and kinds of corruption that would test even the most hardened Space Marine veteran. They fight in the presence of greater daemons. They engage in close combat with entities whose very existence is a corruptive influence on the material world. They operate with a frequency in direct contact with the worst that the warp can manifest into real space that would break the faith of warriors who had not been specifically prepared for it. And they are prepared. The selection and training process is designed specifically to find individuals whose core is genuinely incorruptible, not incorruptible because they have never been offered what chaos offers, but incorruptible because they have seen it offered, have felt the pull of it in its most direct and powerful form, and have remained unmoved anyway. That is the difference. That is what makes the Grey Knights different from simply very brave space marines. They are tested against the actual substance of corruption and found to hold, and the training afterward reinforces that holding until it can be trusted absolutely in conditions that would destroy almost anyone else. The secrecy around their existence is maintained by methods that are, by conventional moral standards, significant in their reach. Individuals who witness Grey Knight operations and survive are subjected to mind wiping. Worlds where the Grey Knights have acted show no official record of their involvement. The chapter's fortress on Titan is not publicly acknowledged to exist. The reason for this concealment is not purely operational security in the military sense. It is theological. Acknowledging the existence of the Grey Knights, a Space Marine chapter whose entire reason for being is to fight literal, physical daemons, would require the Imperial Ecclesiarchy to acknowledge that daemons are literal, physical realities rather than spiritual metaphors for temptation and sin. And the Ecclesiarchy has spent 10,000 years building a religious framework around concepts that its institutional survival depends on keeping abstract. The dark irony that the most elite warriors in service of the Emperor exist in a secret that the institution built to celebrate the Emperor has spent 10,000 years helping to maintain is one that the lore does not explicitly point at, but that sits there for anyone who looks carefully. Chapter 666. The number was not chosen without awareness of what it meant. Part 8. The Tyranids, what drew them here, and what might be behind them. The Tyranids are not native to the Milky Way. They came from the intergalactic void, crossing the enormous distances between galaxies to reach this one. The distances involved in that journey are staggering, even by the standards of a universe where individual worlds are separated by light years. The space between galaxies is vast beyond easy comprehension, with no stellar light, no warp presence in the navigable sense, and no landmarks of any kind. And the Tyranids crossed it, in fleets of biological ships that moved at superluminal speed through real space, using specialized organisms called narvhals to manipulate gravitational fields in ways that the current science of the Imperium cannot fully explain. The first confirmed contact between the Imperium and the Tyranids was in 745 of the 41st millennium, when Hive Fleet Behemoth struck the eastern fringes of the galaxy. Behemoth destroyed world after world in its path, consuming every biological resource it encountered, before being stopped barely, at enormous cost, at the planet Macragge, during a battle that the Ultramarines remember as one of the most brutal in their history. The veteran company that held the orbital defense platforms against the final assault was destroyed to the last warrior. The Ultramarines rebuilt, but the memory of what they faced remained. But subsequent investigations by the Ordo Xenos found evidence that the Tyranids were not entirely new to the galaxy in the 41st millennium. Isolated genestealer infestations, the advanced scouting mechanism the hive mind uses, single organisms or small groups that infiltrate civilizations and infect their hosts with genetic material that creates hybrid offspring over multiple generations, have been identified on worlds dating as far back as the 35th millennium. 6 centuries before the official first contact, they were already present, already seeding, already waiting. This implies a level of premeditation that dramatically changes the character of the threat. The Tyranids did not stumble upon the Milky Way and begin consuming it opportunistically. The hive mind sent scouts ahead of the fleet. Advanced elements, single genestealers, dropped into populations centuries before the main force would arrive, with instructions encoded in their biology to infiltrate, reproduce, build cults of hybrid worshippers, and serve as psychic beacons that would draw the fleet toward the infected world when it eventually came within range. The hive mind itself is a collective consciousness of almost incomprehensible scale. A single, unified psychic presence that is the combined intelligence of every tyrannid organism in the galaxy, existing as one distributed awareness. Each genestealer, each warrior, each hive tyrant is a limb of this vast mind, capable of sophisticated action, but not truly individual thought. When a synapse creature, one of the larger organisms that serve as local relays for the hive mind's signals, is killed, the lesser creatures near it revert to basic animal instinct. They stop being parts of a strategic intelligence and become hungry, disoriented animals. This is the weakness that defenders have learned to exploit. Kill the synapse, sever the link, turn the strategic horror into something that, while still physically formidable, is at least no longer part of a galaxy-spanning unified mind. The hive mind does not exist in the warp. This is one of the things that makes the Tyranids uniquely terrifying among the major factions, because almost every other significant power in the universe has some relationship to the Imperium. Chaos is made of it. The Eldar interact with it constantly. Even humanity uses it for travel and communication. But the hive mind is a psychic entity that exists outside the warp, a consciousness of pure biological origin that projects itself through the material universe without using the demonic dimension as a medium. What the hive mind does to the warp, however, is something that has no precedent in recorded history. It creates the shadow in the warp, a psychic darkness that precedes every major Tyranid fleet, blanketing entire star systems in a kind of psychic static that severs normal connections between the immaterium and real space. Psychers caught in the shadow hear the chittering of a billion alien minds pressing against theirs. Astropaths, whose entire function depends on their psychic connection to the warp, go silent, go mad, or scream explanations that make no sense in any language. Navigators lose their ability to perceive the Astronomicon, which means ships cannot navigate. Worlds consumed by a hive fleet lose all communication with the outside Imperium before the first Tyranid organism lands on their surface, because the shadow cuts them off completely from the rest of the galaxy. Now here is the detail that the Ordo Xenos has quietly been considering for decades, and that the lore raises but carefully refuses to fully answer. What drew the Tyranids to the Milky Way specifically? The galaxy is very large, and the Tyranids came from very far away. Something pointed them at this galaxy, rather than at the thousands of others in the local group. Something acted as a signal bright enough to be perceived across intergalactic distances by whatever senses the hive mind uses. The most widely held theory within the relevant imperial scholarly circles is the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon maintained by the Emperor's life force from the Golden Throne, powered by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, is the brightest psychic signal in the known galaxy. It serves as a lighthouse for imperial navigators. And according to some of the more radical theorists in the Ordo Xenos, it also functioned as an advertisement across the intergalactic void. Something that the hive mind, whatever its senses are and however they operate across those vast distances, perceived as a source of enormous psychic energy and came to consume. If this theory is correct, then the Tyranid invasion, the threat that has consumed billions of lives and represents by most assessments the single greatest existential danger humanity has ever faced, was accidentally called down by the device that humanity depends on to function. The Imperium's greatest navigational tool may have been its greatest strategic mistake. Every ship guided safely through the warp by the Astronomicon's light has been guided by a fire that was inviting something terrible from very far away. And then there is the second theory, the one that sits in the darkest corner of the lore and refuses to be quiet about itself. It is that the Tyranids are not simply predators pursuing the Milky Way. They are fleeing something, that somewhere in the intergalactic void, beyond the range of any sensor the galaxy's civilizations currently possess, there is something that the hive mind, a consciousness of literally incomprehensible scale, something that has consumed entire galaxies in its history, decided was worth running from. To understand what that means, sit with it fully. The Tyranids are the great devourer. They are the species that consumes entire biospheres and strips the genetic material of every living thing it encounters. They are the apex predator of the material universe by any reasonable measurement. And the theory says there is something out there that made them run. What kind of entity causes the great devourer to flee? The lore does not say. It places the question there, in the dark, and allows it to sit. And that is, in the end, the right choice. Because the imagination of what might cause the Tyranids to flee is always going to be worse than any specific answer the lore could provide. What we do know is that the hive fleets seen so far, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and the others are believed by Ordo Xenos scholars to be only the leading elements of a much larger force still in transit through the intergalactic void. The true scale of what is coming, if the main body of the Tyranid race ever arrives, dwarfs everything that has appeared so far, by a degree that makes the current wars look like the preliminary exchange before the battle proper begins. Part 9. The Inquisition's Deepest Shadows. The Inquisition is many things simultaneously. It is humanity's secret police, with authority that extends even to Space Marine chapters. It is the organization that investigates threats too dangerous for conventional authorities to handle. It is the body that maintains the line between what ordinary Imperial citizens know about their universe and what would drive them to madness if they knew it. It is also one of the most internally fractious institutions in the Imperium, so thoroughly divided by its own philosophical conflicts that Inquisitors spend comparable energy investigating each other as they spend investigating external threats. The basic structure of the Inquisition is reasonably well documented, even if most of it operates in shadow. The three great ordos each address a specific category of threat. The Ordo Hereticus investigates internal threats, heresy, unsanctioned psychers, corruption within imperial institutions. The Ordo Malleus addresses demonic threats. The Ordo Xenos handles alien threats. Each ordo has a dedicated military arm capable of carrying out missions that require force rather than just investigation. But beneath the three great ordos is a layer of smaller, more specialized organizations called the Ordos Minoris. These minor ordos investigate threats that do not fit neatly into the main categories, threats that are either too specific to justify a full ordo or too strange to be handled by existing frameworks. Most Inquisitors have never heard of most of them. Even within the Inquisition's own information networks, the Ordos Minoris are largely invisible. The Ordo Chronos is the most fascinating and most completely mysterious of these minor organizations. Its stated purpose was the investigation of temporal anomalies connected to warp travel. This is a legitimate concern. Warp travel does not treat time consistently. Ships emerge from the warp at different points in their departure timeline than their arrival should correspond to. Occasionally, vessels arrive at their destination before they left by real space reckoning. In most cases, these discrepancies are annoying but manageable. In some documented cases, the temporal displacement has been measured in decades. The implications of that, especially for any agent of the Inquisition trying to coordinate long-running operations, are significant. The more extreme concern the Ordo Chronos addressed was deliberate temporal manipulation. If warp transit produces temporal displacement as a side effect, then a sufficiently capable party might be able to use that side effect, intentionally arriving at a point in time other than the one they departed from. The implications of deliberate time travel within the 41st millennium are obviously catastrophic. An enemy with the ability to act in the past could undo any victory. An agent with foreknowledge of future events could manipulate any outcome. The Inquisition took this seriously enough to create a dedicated organization to address it. And then, the Ordo Chronos disappeared entirely. Every Inquisitor associated with it, every archivist, acolyte, and operative, every active investigation, and every archive of information accumulated during the Ordo's history, gone. Not killed in battle, not reorganized into another structure, not formally dissolved with documentation of the dissolution, simply absent in a manner that no one who knew of their existence has ever been able to explain. The legends that persist within the Inquisition's most senior circles speak of a structure called the Gates of Moment, a moon that functions as a time-space portal of ancient and unknown origin. The story, told in the quietest possible circumstances to the fewest possible people, is that a team of Ordo Chronos Inquisitors attempted to close this gateway, understanding it as a source of dangerous temporal instability. They failed. And in failing, they were consumed by the phenomenon they were attempting to eliminate, pulled through the gate into some other point in time, and unable to return. Whether they exist somewhere in a different era, a group of inquisitors investigating temporal anomalies in a time period that has no mechanism for them to report back from, is a question the lore leaves permanently open. The Ordo Chronos has recently shown signs of reconstitution, as if the people who disappeared have found a way to begin coming back. What they know about where they have been, and what they found there, remains one of the stranger open questions in a universe full of them. The broader philosophical divide within the Inquisition between the Puritans, who hold that the Emperor's law must be followed strictly and no contaminating tools or knowledge ever employed, and the Radicals, who believe that existential threats justify extraordinary and ordinarily prohibited measures, is itself one of the defining features of the organization's internal life. Inquisitors operate under a legal framework that any inquisitor can investigate any other inquisitor, and inquisitorial conclaves can convene to address the most serious cases. In practice, this means the Inquisition is continuously engaged in a low-level civil war with itself, prosecuting members for practices that other factions consider legitimate, forming temporary alliances to bring down individuals whose methods are deemed too extreme, and navigating a political landscape that makes the already complex politics of the wider Imperium look simple. There are inquisitors who use demonic artifacts as weapons. There are inquisitors who maintain what amount to demonic allies, entities from the warp bound to their service through contracts that more Puritan colleagues would consider grounds for immediate execution. There are inquisitors who have studied forbidden texts so thoroughly that their knowledge of demonic lore rivals that of chaos sorcerers. There are inquisitors who have made deals with alien species for information or technology, and for every inquisitor doing any of these things, there is another inquisitor somewhere in the galaxy who is building a case against them. The Inquisition's greatest structural secret is perhaps the simplest. It has been operating for 10,000 years under a mandate defined by a man who has been effectively dead for that entire period, making interpretive decisions about what the Emperor would have wanted with no mechanism for verification, in conditions that would have been completely unrecognizable to the people who founded it. And the accumulated institutional weight of 10,000 years of self-referential interpretation of a founding mandate that cannot be tested against its original source has produced an organization that is as much a product of its own history as it is a product of its stated purpose. Part 10. The Officio Assassinorum and the Calidus Temple's particular horror. The Officio Assassinorum is the Imperium's institutionalized murder bureau. That description, blunt as it is more accurate than any diplomatic euphemism the organization's official designations might suggest. It exists to kill specific people on behalf of imperial authority, and it is extraordinarily effective at what it does. The different temples within the Officio each represent a different philosophy of killing, and the range of approaches available reflects the extraordinary technological and biological sophistication that the organization has developed over thousands of years of continuous operation. The Vindicare Temple produces the finest marksmen in the Imperium. Vindicare assassins are trained to a degree of accuracy that strains credibility until you remember that they have been extensively modified at the biological level, equipped with weapons, specifically engineered for their function, and subjected to decades of training that would not be recognizable to anyone outside the temple. They are the cleanest expression of the Officio's purpose. A person needs to be removed, the appropriate tool is deployed, the target is removed, the mission is concluded. The Eversor Temple exists at the other extreme of the philosophical spectrum. Eversor assassins are less weapons of precision than weapons of comprehensive elimination. They are deployed when the Imperium wishes to eliminate not just an individual but everything and everyone in the immediate vicinity, and to do so in a manner sufficiently dramatic that the message carried is impossible to misread. Eversor assassins travel to their deployment in stasis, because an Eversor assassin, awake and unsupervised, is a genuine threat to everyone around them. Once deployed, they kill with complete commitment to total environmental elimination. The Culexus Temple houses nulls individuals born without any psychic resonance, whose existence generates an aura of profound wrongness in the warp. To a psyker, a Culexus's presence is experienced as a physical assault, a sensation of wrongness so comprehensive it can incapacitate. To a daemon, the proximity of a Culexus is existentially threatening beings, defined by their psychic nature, cannot easily persist near something that fundamentally negates that nature. And then there is the Calidus Temple. The Calidus specialize in infiltration of the most complete and disturbing kind. Their operatives use a substance called polymorphine, which affects the body at the cellular level, allowing controlled restructuring of physical form. Bones can be compressed or extended. Muscle mass can be redistributed. Facial features can be genuinely altered to create a different face rather than simply disguising an existing one. With preparation and skill, a Calidus operative can become any humanoid creature in the galaxy human. Eldar, Tau, anything that falls within a certain range of size and structural similarity. Not a costume, not prosthetics. A genuine biological transformation that passes physical scrutiny of a kind that no disguise or prosthetic ever could. The implications extend in disturbing directions the moment you think about them carefully. If you can become anyone, you can occupy any position of trust. A Calidus operative who has been in place long enough has not simply gotten close to a target. They have become, for all practical purposes, the person they are impersonating. Their mannerisms, their behavioral patterns, their relationships with the people around them, all of these can be maintained to a degree of fidelity that makes detection by ordinary means essentially impossible. The case of the operative, who came to be known within the temple as Mother Gullet, illustrates both the capability and the moral architecture of the organization with stark clarity. The target was a planetary governor, suspected of heretical sympathies, who had proven difficult to access through conventional assassination approaches. The governor was heavily guarded, deeply paranoid, restricted in his movements, and surrounded by a staff whose loyalty had been secured through mechanisms that made conventional infiltration impractical. The operative identified that the governor had a profound and poorly concealed attachment to his young son, an emotional vulnerability that constituted the most accessible leverage point in an otherwise well-defended position. Using polymorphine, she transformed into the appearance of the boy's nanny, integrated into the household, and over weeks established the degree of familiarity and routine that made her presence unremarkable to everyone around her. And when the moment required her to leave the palace without leaving the child behind, as a potential witness or complicating factor, she used the full scope of her polymorphine-enhanced biology to swallow the boy, holding him alive within her transformed body as she walked calmly out through the palace's security. The child was recovered afterward. The governor was dealt with in due course. The mission was considered a success. What the Lord does with this story, presenting it as an example of Calidus ingenuity, rather than as something to be morally accounted for, is itself significant. The Officio Assassinorum does not have an ethical department in the conventional sense. Within the framework of an organization dedicated to removing specific individuals on behalf of imperial authority, the moral calculus reduces to a single question: did the mission succeed? The methods used to achieve that success are evaluated for their future applicability, not for their conformity to standards external to the mission. This is not unique to the Calidus Temple. It is the general operating logic of the Imperium in its most concentrated form. The Imperium does terrible things because it has concluded, accurately or not, depending on how you weigh the evidence, that the alternative to doing terrible things is the destruction of the human race. Every atrocity committed in the Emperor's name exists within a system that genuinely believes these acts are the minimum required cost of continued existence. The Calidus Temple is what that logic looks like when applied to the individual level, stripped of all abstraction, and delivered in the form of a person who can become your most trusted colleague. There are temples within the Officio Assassinorum that the lore barely acknowledges before moving on. The Merorus Temple, which existed for a period before being formally dissolved under circumstances that remain officially unrecorded, produced operatives modified in ways that surviving accounts describe, with a vagueness, suggesting the modifications went significantly further than anything the other temples engage in. Whatever the Merorus operatives were capable of, it was deemed excessive by the standards of an organization that considers Mother Gullet's approach to be a demonstration of ingenuity. That an organization devoted to targeted killing, that regularly deploys operatives who can reshape their bodies and who think in terms of swallowing children as viable tactical options, has a concept of excessive that caused one of its branches to be dissolved and its records sealed. This says something about the depth of the thing we are looking at. It says that the floor of acceptable methods within the Imperium's most extreme instruments is lower than most people think, and that even in that space, there are things that those instruments themselves determined should not be done. The Officio Assassinorum answers not to the High Lords of Terra, nor to the Inquisition. It answers, in theory, directly to the office of the Emperor. And since the Emperor has not given direct orders in 10,000 years, the organization operates under its founding mandate and its own internal leadership, with a degree of autonomous authority that is either reassuring or terrifying, depending entirely on how much faith you have in the judgment of professional killers given 10 millennia to operate without external oversight. Part 11. What the lore leaves unsaid, and why the silence matters. We have traveled a long way tonight. The erased suns and their expunged legions, the great plan that failed and the machine that imprisoned its architect, the gods made of everyone's worst moments, the war that predates memory and left permanent marks on the shape of reality, the brotherhood that guards its shame across millennia, the secret chapter that officially does not exist, the consuming intelligence from beyond the galaxy, the investigators who investigate each other, the specialists who are too effective for morality to complicate. Each of these secrets is significant on its own terms, but there is something they share a quality that connects them at a structural level and that I want to close with, because it is the thing that makes Warhammer 40,000 genuinely extraordinary as world building rather than simply an impressive accumulation of grimdark aesthetic. Every major secret in the lore is ultimately about the problem of knowledge and power, and what happens when the people who hold power decide that the people without it should not be allowed to know certain things. The Emperor kept the Mekboy project from the Primarchs because he decided, perhaps wrongly, that knowing would cause more problems than not knowing. The Imperium keeps the existence of the Grey Knights from its citizens because knowing that demons are literal physical realities would require the ecclesiarchy to acknowledge theological facts. It has spent 10,000 years managing as metaphors. The Dark Angels keep the existence of the fallen from their own rank and file, because the institution decided, long ago, that the shame of the truth was too dangerous to expose even to the people who live and fight inside the institution that carries it. The Inquisition keeps most of what it knows from the ordinary population, because it has concluded, generation after generation, that what ordinary people do not know cannot hurt them in the specific way that knowing would. The common thread is the assumption that concealment is, on balance, protective, that the people with access to the full truth are better positioned to manage it than the people who would be exposed to it unprepared, and that those people, the ones who know, can be trusted to use that knowledge wisely. 10,000 years of the Imperium of Man suggests a different conclusion. The Mekboy project failed, in part, because of secrecy. The Dark Angel's operational effectiveness has been compromised for 10 millennia by the institutional weight of concealing the fallen. The Inquisition's internal conflicts, which cost real resources and real lives, are substantially driven by the opacity of each Inquisitor's methods to every other Inquisitor. The Lost Legions are a wound in the mythology of the Space Marines that has never healed, precisely because the wound was made by the act of covering it rather than by the original events. But the Imperium keeps keeping secrets anyway, because the alternative full transparency, open accounting of what has happened and why, and what it cost, requires institutional courage that the Imperium does not have and has never had. It requires the ability to tell people things that will change how they behave, and to trust that the change will be manageable. And the Imperium does not trust. It controls. It manages. It curates the experience of reality available to its citizens and soldiers and servants with the careful, paternalistic anxiety of an institution that has concluded that most of the people it governs cannot handle most of the truth about their situation. And here is the most interesting thing about all of this. The Imperium may be right in a narrow and specific sense. The ordinary citizen of the 41st millennium, living their difficult life on a world that is perhaps not actively being invaded, but is certainly subject to imperial taxation and mandatory labor, and the ever-present threat of some great horror arriving from the void, that person might genuinely function better with the story they have been given than with the full account. The story of the God Emperor and his divine purpose, and the angels who protect humanity, and the faith that sustains the righteous, that story works. Not because it is entirely true, but because stories that work do not need to be entirely true to sustain people through things that are difficult. The guardsman in the trench, who prays to the emperor before the enemy advances, is drawing on something real, even if the relationship between what he believes about the emperor and what the emperor actually is has been shaped by 10,000 years of institutional curation. His faith is real. His courage is real. The thing he is defending is real. Whether the theological framework around those real things is accurate in every detail is perhaps secondary to whether it helps him hold the line when holding the line matters. But the secrets accumulate. The buried truths press against the structures that contain them. The institutional weight of 10,000 years of carefully managed reality eventually develops cracks, and when it does, when some truth escapes the archive, it has been kept in and enters the broader consciousness of the people who have been living in its absence. The consequences are not predictable in the way that the carefully managed version of reality was predictable. The galaxy is not kind to the people who live in it. The chaos gods are not weakening. The Necrons are waking up. The Tyranids are coming in, forces greater than anything yet seen. The Golden Throne is failing. The Primarchs are returning to an Imperium that has spent 10,000 years running on their father's legacy without any input from them, and what they are finding when they return does not in every case resemble what they left behind. In the middle of all of this, on a million worlds, ordinary people are doing something that no secret organization and no ancient conspiracy and no god of any kind can take away from them. They are simply keeping going, guardsmen at their posts, medicaes in their field stations, void sailors keeping ancient ships operational through sheer institutional stubbornness, scribes maintaining records that may never be read, priests offering comfort to people who are terrified in ways that the priests often share. None of them know most of what we have talked about tonight. None of them know the full scale of what the Mekboy project was supposed to be and what its failure cost. None of them know what the chaos gods are made of, what it means that the emotions of living beings are the actual substance of the worst enemies in the universe. None of them know the true origin of the war in heaven, or what the Cetan were, or what the old ones built and lost and left behind. None of them know about the Grey Knights, or the full depth of the Dark Angel's shame, or the things that make even trained assassins decide some methods are too much. But they keep going, and, in keeping going, in the accumulated daily weight of ordinary courage repeated across a million worlds and 10,000 years by people who have been told and who have chosen to believe that it is worth it, there is something that is not quite beautiful and not quite tragic, but is somehow both. The Emperor may be dying. The Mekboy project may be a dream that will never be realized. The Chaos Gods may never be fully defeated. The Necrons may reclaim their dominion in time. The Tyranids may consume everything that breathes. But tonight, on some world whose name will never appear in any record you will ever read, a soldier is standing at a post in the rain, watching for things that move in the dark. And he has decided that the watch is worth keeping. That is the deepest piece of lore in Warhammer 40,000, not hidden in a sealed archive, not encrypted behind 7 ciphers. Written on the face of every ordinary person who lives and dies in the Imperium without a legend to mark their passing. They are all the heroes of a story the Imperium will never officially tell. And in the telling of it here, in the quiet and the dark, they become the most important people in the whole terrible, beautiful universe. Thank you for being here for all of this. If you made it from the beginning to here, you are the kind of person this channel is built for. Someone who does not just want to know what happened, but wants to understand what it means. Someone willing to sit in the dark with an old and complicated universe and let its weight settle properly before moving on. If something in tonight's lore settled differently in your mind, if one particular secret is going to stay with you after this, I want to know what it is. Leave it in the comments. Tell me where in the world you are watching from right now and what time it is where you are. These comments genuinely matter, both as connection and as the signal that makes these long videos worth continuing to make. If you are not already subscribed, now is the moment. More videos like this one are coming, long, atmospheric, patient dives into the parts of this universe that deserve the most careful attention. Subscribe so you do not miss them. Until the next one, stay in the dark. There is always more to find here, for the Emperor, and for the watch that never ends. Supplementary deep dive: the Horus Heresy's hidden layers, what the official account conceals. There is a version of the Horus Heresy that the Imperium tells officially. It is taught in the Scholastica Progenium, embedded in the liturgy of the ecclesiarchy, referenced in the oaths taken by Space Marine initiates across 1,000 chapters, and used as the defining moral framework around which imperial theology has organized itself for 10,000 years. In that version, Horus was the best of the Emperor's sons, the war master beloved above all others, who was corrupted by the lies of chaos during his recovery from a wound received on Davin, turned against his father, and led a catastrophic civil war that nearly ended the human race before being slain by the Emperor himself in single combat above Terra. This version is not false, but it is remarkably selective. The truth of what the Horus Heresy actually was, the full ecological and psychological and institutional complexity of how you go from the pinnacle of human civilization to its near destruction in the span of a few decades, is something the Imperium has never fully confronted, because fully confronting it would require acknowledging uncomfortable things about the Emperor, about the structure of the Imperium he built, and about the nature of the forces he was fighting that cannot easily be incorporated into a theology that requires those forces to be simply and comparky. Consider, for instance, the word-bearers. In the official account, the word-bearers are the most ideologically corrupted of the traitor legions, the ones who deliberately sought out chaos and the ruinous powers, and built their heresy on a foundation of theological conviction rather than rage or despair or ambition. And this is true. But what the official account does not dwell on is why Lorgar, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, felt he needed that theological foundation in the first place. Lorgar was, among all the Primarchs, the one who most deeply and sincerely loved the Emperor. He built temples. He wrote the Lectitio Divinitatis, the text that would become the foundation of the imperial cult, arguing that the Emperor was not merely a great man, but a genuine divine being worthy of religious devotion. He brought worlds into the Imperium not through military conquest, but through faith, through the building of communities of belief that welcomed the Emperor as their god. His approach was slower than pure military conquest. It was less efficient in the narrow tactical sense, but the worlds he brought in were genuinely devoted, their populations transformed by a faith that gave their daily lives meaning in a universe that was difficult and dangerous and often cruel. And the Emperor told him to stop. Publicly, emphatically, in an act called the Chastisement of Lorgar, the Emperor landed on one of the Word-Bearers' newly devoted worlds, Hur, and had the Ultramarines destroy the city that the Word-Bearers had spent 40 years building as a monument to imperial faith. He stood before Lorgar in front of his legion and told him that what he was building was wrong, that the Imperium was not a religious institution, that the Emperor was not a god and did not want to be worshipped, that Lorgar had been wasting time on superstition when he should have been conquering. What the Emperor was doing, by his own understanding, was protecting the imperial truth, the official secular philosophy of the early Imperium that held that reason and science, not faith and superstition, were the correct tools for understanding the universe. The Emperor genuinely believed this. He had spent thousands of years fighting against the corruption that came from human psychic energy, feeding the warp, and he had concluded that the best defense against that corruption was a civilization that did not feed the warp by praying to gods, because the only gods that human prayer could strengthen were the chaos gods. But from Lorgar's perspective, what happened on Kur was the most profound betrayal imaginable. He had given 40 years to building something in sincere love and faith, and the being he had been building it for had destroyed it and called it worthless. The wound this created in Lorgar was not the wound of a vain man whose ego was bruised. It was the wound of someone whose most sincere devotion was rejected without explanation in a way that made sincere devotion itself feel like a form of foolishness. Lorgar looked for another god to give that devotion to, and the Chaos gods were ready. They had been patient. They had been watching. They knew exactly how to approach a Primarch whose fundamental need was to love something cosmic and be loved in return, who had been told by the being he loved most completely that his love was an embarrassing mistake. Chaos met Lorgar where he was and offered him exactly what the Emperor had taken away: a theology in which devotion had cosmic meaning, in which faith was answered with real power, in which the divine was not indifferent to the devotion of mortals. The word-bearer's heresy is, from inside their own perspective, a story about sincerity betrayed and faith redirected. It does not make them right. Their subsequent actions were monstrous by any reasonable measure. The destruction of worlds, the deliberate cultivation of demonic corruption as a missionary tool, the wholesale embrace of the very forces that the Emperor had spent millennia trying to protect humanity from. But the starting point was not malice. It was a wound that the Emperor, through an excess of secular conviction and an insufficient attention to the human reality of the being he was dealing with, inflicted himself. Now consider Magnus. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, was the most gifted psyker among all the Primarchs. He had developed, over centuries of the Great Crusade, a mastery of psychic arts that exceeded even what the Emperor himself had formally sanctioned. He had delved into the warp with a thoroughness and an enthusiasm that many of his brother Primarchs found unsettling. He had made, at some point, a compact with a being within the warp that the other Primarchs did not know about, a compact that gave him access to knowledge and power beyond what the Emperor's official guidelines for psychic use permitted. Magnus did not understand himself to be doing anything wrong. He thought he was being pragmatic, using the tools available to him in service of goals that were entirely loyal. The Great Crusade needed intelligence. The warp contained intelligence. He could access it. He accessed it. What happened to the souls of his warriors in the process of his most extreme workings? A slow and terrible process called flesh change that corrupted them at the cellular level, their bodies gradually losing coherence as the warp energy they had been exposed to rewrote them from the inside. Was something Magnus managed by suppressing the mutation through his own psychic will, rather than by stopping the practices that caused it? When he tried to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption, the choice to use a direct psychic projection of enormous power was, from his perspective, the only option available quickly enough to matter. He did not know what was underneath the imperial palace. He did not know that his projection would shatter protections he could not see. He did not know that the act of trying to save everything would break something fundamental. The Primarchs were not told what was below the palace. The Emperor did not explain the stakes. The consequences of Magnus's sending the breach, the demonic flood, the destruction of the Webway project, were not foreseeable by anyone who did not know what the Emperor was protecting. And the Emperor had told no one. Magnus was punished for the warning that saved the Imperium's knowledge of Horus's treachery, punished in a way that destroyed his legion and drove him into the arms of Tzeentch, the chaos god of knowledge and change who had been cultivating a relationship with Magnus for decades. The Space Wolves, led by Leman Russ, attacked Prospero under the Emperor's orders before the betrayal of Magnus was fully understood by anyone, including the Space Wolves themselves. The destruction of an entire civilization of psychers, the burning of a world of knowledge and art and careful scholarship built over centuries, was the price of Magnus's attempt to help. He ended up serving Tzeentch, not because he was corrupted in the simple sense, because the Imperium he had tried to save destroyed everything he had built and then offered him nothing in return but condemnation. These are not sympathetic portraits of the traitor Primarchs in the sense of excusing what they became. Magnus, in the 41st millennium, is a daemon prince who serves chaos and causes enormous harm. Lorgar's word-bearers have committed atrocities on a galactic scale. The traitor Primarchs made choices that cannot be undone and have had consequences that have defined 10,000 years of suffering. But understanding the full texture of how those choices happened, the wounds, the misunderstandings, the failures of trust and communication that the Emperor's own secrecy and the structure of the Great Crusade created, is necessary to understand the heresy in its full depth. The official account strips that texture out and presents a cleaner story of betrayal and loyalty that is easier to teach and easier to hold as a moral framework. The Imperium needs the clean story. It needs Horus to be a cautionary tale, a corruption to be warned against, a name to invoke when speaking of the danger of pride and the reach of chaos. It needs the traitor legions to be simply wrong, their fall to chaos, a product of weakness and sin, rather than a complex interaction of genuine grievances. bad decisions, systemic failures, and the patient cultivation of fractures by entities that had been studying the Primarchs' psychologies for longer than most of them had been alive. The Horus Heresy was a tragedy in the classical sense, not just disaster, but disaster that was in some important sense inevitable given the characters involved and the conditions they were placed in. An emperor too secretive, too certain of his own vision, too little attentive to the human realities of the beings he had created. Sons too powerful to be managed easily, with psychologies shaped by the alien worlds that raised them, with needs and wounds and capacities that the emperor had not fully modeled when he designed them. An enemy that had been studying those sons since before they were scattered as infants, preparing specifically for the vulnerabilities it could see. And a plan so ambitious and so carefully concealed that even its architect could not maintain control of all its variables. The official version of the Horus Heresy teaches imperial citizens and soldiers what to think about betrayal and loyalty and the danger of chaos. The full version teaches something harder and more useful: what happens to the best-laid plans of the most powerful mind in human history when the people those plans depend on are not given the information they need to support those plans wisely. Supplementary depth: the Eldar's fall and the birth of a god. There is a hole in the universe. It has been there since the 32nd millennium, give or take the vagaries of warp-adjacent dating, and it sits in a region of space that the maps of the 41st millennium label as the Eye of Terror. It is not simply a region of strong warp influence, the kind of area that exists across the galaxy wherever the membrane between real space and the immaterium is thin. It is a genuine tear, a permanent breach between the two dimensions that has been maintained for 10,000 years by the presence of the thing that made it. That thing is Slaanesh. The birth of Slaanesh is perhaps the most dramatic single event in the entire history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and it is also one of the most thoroughly documented from the inside, because the Eldar who survived it carry the memory of what their civilization was before it happened and what the universe was like in the moment it occurred. The event itself is called the Fall of the Eldar, and like most events of truly catastrophic scale, it had been coming for longer than anyone wanted to admit. The Eldar Empire at its height was the dominant civilization of the galaxy. It had been dominant for tens of thousands of years, following the conclusion of the War in Heaven, inheriting a galaxy largely emptied of competition and filling it with art, philosophy, science, and culture of a refinement that surpassed anything the younger species of the later age could achieve. The Eldar were psychically extraordinarily gifted, one of the Old One's most successful biological experiments, beings for whom the warp and the material universe were not separate domains, but aspects of a continuous experience. Their cities were built in ways that incorporated psychic resonance as a structural element. Their art created experiences that engaged both the physical and the psychic senses simultaneously. Their understanding of both the material universe and the immaterium was millennial deep, and they became, over the long centuries of their dominance, increasingly interested in experience for its own sake, in sensation, in the refinement of pleasure to its ultimate forms, in pushing every kind of experience to its furthest possible expression, because they were long-lived enough to complete the project and skilled enough to sustain it. What began as the natural cultural evolution of a sophisticated and long-established civilization slowly became something else. Cults devoted to the most extreme forms of sensation emerged, grew, and began to define the character of entire city worlds. The psychic resonance of tens of thousands of years of Eldar civilization, channeled increasingly through the frequencies of excess and desire and the pursuit of sensation beyond limit, poured into the warp in a slow, steady accumulation. The Chaos Gods feel this kind of concentrated emotional output. They are made of it, and the entity that was coalescing in the warp from the accumulated psychic residue of Eldar excess was not small. It was vast, and it was growing, and the Eldar who knew enough to notice were either too deeply embedded in the culture that was feeding it to care, or too isolated from the centers of power to make anyone listen. When Slaanesh was finally born, when the accumulated psychic mass of tens of thousands of years of Eldar excess finally reached the threshold of consciousness and desire and will, the event was not gradual. It was instantaneous and total. A psychic shock wave of almost unimaginable intensity propagated through the warp and into real space simultaneously. The Eldar, across most of their empire, simply died. Their souls, already deeply connected to the warp, were consumed in the moment of Slaaneish's birth, drawn into the new god like water into a drain. The great Eldar cities, the craft worlds that had not managed to flee in time, the vast population of the most powerful psychic civilization in the galaxy, gone, in a moment, consumed to feed the birth of a god that they had unwittingly spent 10,000 years building. The survivors were those who had managed to flee onto the craft worlds before the fall-vast world ships that carried the survivors into the relatively safe transit corridors between the Imperium and real space, protected by psychic wards of Eldar manufacture that Slaanesh could not immediately penetrate. And those who had retreated into the webway itself, into the dark city of Camorra, where the new god's power was somewhat attenuated by the webway's own psychic insulation. The Eye of Terror, the permanent warp rift that marks the location of the birth, is the physical scar left by the moment of Slaaneish's emergence. The psychic shock of the event tore the fabric between real space and the warp, in a region of space so large that entire star systems exist within it, now fully within the warp's domain, twisted and corrupted, and home to the chaos forces that have used it as a base since the Horus Heresy. The Eldar of the craft worlds, in the 41st millennium, live with the knowledge of what their ancestors did and what it cost. They wear on their bodies, near their hearts, devices called spirit stones, psychic matrices, that will capture their soul at the moment of death and prevent it from being consumed by Slaanesh, who is permanently hungry for the souls of the species that gave him birth. They must wear these stones. Without them, at the moment of death, an Eldar's soul does not pass naturally into whatever comes after death for other species. It is taken by the god born of their ancestors' excess, who will consume it in the same moment that he consumed the vast majority of their civilization 10,000 years ago. The Eldar are a people who have been hunted by their own god since before many of the other species in the galaxy existed in their current forms. Every day of Eldar life is lived in the shadow of a being that they created, that hungers specifically for them, and that they cannot destroy, because it is now a genuine chaos, God sustained by the psychic residue of all the galaxy's living beings, and not merely by the Eldar alone. That is the context for every Eldar action in the 41st millennium. The cryptic manipulations, the willingness to sacrifice other species, including humanity, for objectives that seem from outside to be coldly calculated to an alien logic. The desperate measures of the Farseer councils, who look into probable futures and make decisions based on preserving not just Eldar survival, but the specific futures in which something like redemption is still possible. They are not simply a dying race making selfish choices. They are a dying race living in the direct presence of the consequence of their ancestors' failures, carrying the full weight of that consequence in the form of spirit stones against their hearts, trying to navigate a universe that contains the thing that destroyed them as a permanent and hungry feature of reality. The next time an Eldar character in a novel makes a choice that seems callous or incomprehensible, it is worth holding that context. They are not indifferent to the suffering their choices cause. They are terrified in a way that spans 10,000 years and is written into their theology and their technology and the daily practice of a culture organized entirely around survival in conditions that would have ended most civilizations before now. Every Eldar alive is a living argument that it is possible to survive the very worst thing imaginable. And every Eldar alive carries in their chest the psychic container that will keep their souls safe from the thing that proved them right about what the very worst thing imaginable actually is. The birth of Slaanesh is the Eldar's original sin, their founding catastrophe, their irreversible loss. And it is also, for the wider galaxy, the event that put the fourth great chaos god in place and completed the pantheon that has defined the spiritual ecology of the universe for 10,000 years since. Without the fall of the Eldar, Slaanesh would not exist as a fully formed deity. Without Slaanesh, the chaos pantheon would be permanently incomplete. The galaxy would be different in ways that are difficult to model but easy to intuit as better. Less dark, perhaps. Less hungry. Less defined by the presence of a god who was born from beauty and now produces only suffering. The Eldar did not choose this. Their ancestors did, through 10,000 years of choices that seemed individually harmless and collectively catastrophic. That is the nature of this kind of calamity. It does not arrive announced as calamity. It arrives as refinement, as sophistication, as the natural evolution of culture that has been successful for so long, it has stopped asking whether its direction is wise. The Imperium of man is not immune to this dynamic. The lore, for those who look, makes that clear. The same slow accumulation of choices, each individually defensible, each building towards something that the individual decision makers cannot see, because the scale exceeds any individual perspective. This is happening in the Imperium too. It has been happening since the heresy. Whether the endpoint will be as catastrophic as the fall of the Eldar is a question the 41st millennium has not yet finished answering. Final meditation. Why these secrets matter, beyond the lore. There is a reason that the Warhammer 40,000 universe, at its best and most thoughtful, does not present its secrets as simple Easter eggs or clever bits of retroactive continuity. The secrets of this universe are doing something more interesting than that. They are exploring, in the heightened and exaggerated form that speculative fiction makes possible, questions that are genuinely live and genuinely difficult about the real world that we inhabit. What happens when the most powerful institutions decide that the people they serve cannot handle the full truth of their situation? What happens to the capacity for trust when the architecture of daily life is built on managed information and selective disclosure? What is lost when the full texture of history, including its failures, its wounds, its catastrophic misunderstandings, is replaced with a version designed to support a specific ongoing program of feeling? The Imperium of man gives you the worst-case version of those answers, lived out across 10,000 years on the scale of an interstellar civilization. The Lost Legions show you what an erasure looks like from the outside. The shape of the absence is more disturbing than any account of what was there could be. The Mekboy project shows you what overconfidence in one's own judgment costs. When the stakes are civilizational, the architect's certainty that he alone could manage the variables perfectly became the flaw that destroyed the plan. The Dark Angels show you what shame does to an institution when the institution decides that managing the shame is more important than addressing it. The hunt for the fallen has made the chapter less effective, less trustworthy, and arguably less true to whatever the First Legion was originally supposed to be. None of these are warnings in the simple didactic sense. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is too sophisticated for that. It does not tell you that secrets are always bad, or that transparency always wins, or that institutions should be trusted or distrusted uniformly. It shows you the full complexity of those questions worked out in extreme conditions, and it trusts the reader to extract from that complexity whatever is useful for thinking about the less extreme conditions of actual life. That trust, the trust that the reader is capable of handling the full complexity, is itself a form of respect. And it is, in the end, the most significant contrast between how the universe's fictional institutions treat the people in them and how the lore of the universe treats the people reading it. The Imperium withholds, the lore does not. The Imperium curates, the lore elaborates. The Imperium buries its painful truths because it has concluded that the population it governs cannot be trusted with them. The lore gives you the painful truths because it has concluded, over decades of creation, that the people who love this universe are exactly the kind of people who can be trusted to sit with difficulty and find something worth keeping in it. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also the patient, careful, sustained act of trying to understand something genuinely complicated. And that act, practiced in fictional universes as in real ones, is one of the most human things there is. That is why these secrets matter beyond the lore. They are exercises in the practice of paying close attention to complicated things, in sitting with the weight of difficult knowledge long enough for it to mean something, in refusing the comfort of the simplified version when the full version is available. Stay in the dark. There is always more to find here. The Mechanicus secret, the Omnissiah, heresy, and the God in the machine. There is a theological problem sitting at the heart of the Imperium that almost no one within the Imperium is formally allowed to acknowledge, because acknowledging it fully would require two of the Imperium's most powerful institutions to have a conversation about the nature of their shared faith that neither has ever been willing to have. The Adeptus Mechanicus worships the Omnissiah. The Omnissiah is their supreme deity, the embodiment of all machine knowledge and technological understanding in the universe, the divine source from which all science and all craft and all understanding of the physical laws of existence flow. The Omnissiah is venerated in every forge world, in every tech priest's daily ritual of self-maintenance and machine prayer, in the specific ceremonies that accompany the creation of new technology and the maintenance of ancient systems. The machine god is the foundation of Mechanicus theology. The ecclesiarchy, the ministorum, worships the emperor. The emperor is the god of mankind, the divine protector of the human race, the supreme spiritual authority in the universe. The ecclesiarchy has, over 10,000 years, built an extraordinarily elaborate theological edifice around the emperor's divinity, one that incorporates the various Space Marine chapters as divine agents, the Inquisition as righteous enforcers, and the entire apparatus of the Imperium as the earthly expression of divine will. The problem is that within the Adeptus Mechanicus, there is a widely held belief, not officially stated, not formally documented, but present in the theology as an obvious implication that everyone within the Mechanicus understands, and that outsiders who are paying attention can read clearly that the Omnissiah and the Emperor are the same being, that the god of machines and the god of mankind are not two deities but one, viewed from two different angles by two different institutional cultures that developed in relative isolation from each other. If this is true, the ecclesiarchy and the Mechanicus are worshipping the same being and have been doing so for 10,000 years, separately, without formally acknowledging the convergence, because the formal acknowledgement would require both institutions to negotiate the theological and political implications of shared divinity, implications that would significantly rearrange the relative standing of both organizations within the broader power structure of the Imperium. The Emperor himself, during the period of his active rule, explicitly denied being a god. The imperial truth, his official secular philosophy, held that the universe operated according to laws discoverable by science and reason, and that the various deities worshipped by human cultures were at best psychic phenomena, mistaken for divine beings, and at worst active vectors for chaos, corruption. He found the religious fervor of Lorgar, as we discussed earlier, deeply counterproductive, and yet the Emperor was demonstrably not an ordinary human being. His psychic power was of an order that defies the categories available to describe it. His lifespan, 48,000 years before his internment on the Golden Throne, places him in the category of beings that mortal minds struggle to conceptualize as human at all. The question of whether a being with 48,000 years of existence and psychic power that can reshape the warp in the material universe constitutes a god is one that the Emperor's own denial does not fully answer, because the category of being that could make that denial credibly may simply not exist in any form that we have adequate words for. The Mechanicus navigates this by not formally asking the question at all. The Omnissiah is the divine source of all machine knowledge. The Emperor is on the Golden Throne. Whether these two facts describe the same being is, within Mechanicus theological practice, simply not a matter that requires resolution. The worship continues. The rituals continue. The tech priests maintain both their faith and their remarkable ability to not push any single premise to its logical conclusion when the conclusion would be inconvenient. This is, in some ways, the most perfectly imperially thing in the entire lore. The Imperium of Man, in all its complexity and all its weight of institutional history, has managed to arrange its most fundamental theological question such that no one within it who has the power to ask the question formally is permitted by their institutional role to do so. The ecclesiarchy cannot ask whether the Omnissiah is the Emperor, because that would require acknowledging Mechanicus theology as having independent standing. The Mechanicus cannot ask whether the Omnissiah is the Emperor, because that would require engaging with ecclesiarchal theology on terms that would weaken Mechanicus independence. And the Emperor himself is not answering questions. So the question sits there, unanswered, in the space between two of the most powerful institutions in the galaxy for 10,000 years. An open secret that everyone understands and no one says aloud, which is, in the end, perhaps the most accurate description of the Imperium of Man that the lore provides anywhere. A civilization built on open secrets that everyone understands and no one says aloud, maintained by institutions with too much invested in the current arrangement to risk the disruption of honest inquiry, sustained by ordinary people who keep doing their jobs in the confident knowledge that someone, somewhere, understands the full picture and is managing it wisely. Whether that confidence is warranted is the question the lore has been exploring for decades without providing a final answer. And, wisely so, because a final answer would close something that is most valuable for remaining open. The secrets of Warhammer 40,000 are not puzzles to be solved. They are depths to be inhabited. They are the architecture of a universe that takes both its darkness and its light seriously enough to make the relationship between them genuinely complicated. They are the reason that this fictional universe, 40+ years after its creation, still generates the kind of conversation you are having right now, still rewards careful attention with new layers to find, still feels like a place where there is always more to discover if you are willing to look closely enough and stay long enough in the dark. Thank you for that willingness tonight. It means more than I can easily say. For the Emperor, for the watch that never ends, and for all the secrets we have not yet found. One more layer: the Navigator houses and the monopoly on the void. There is an institution that the Imperium's mainstream historical accounts barely acknowledge, despite the fact that the entire navigational capacity of the Imperial fleet depends on it, absolutely. The Navigator houses, the Navis Nobilite, occupy a position in the power structure of the Imperium that is simultaneously indispensable and deeply precarious, and the tension between those two conditions has defined their institutional character across 10,000 years in ways that the lore rewards careful examination of. Navigators are mutant humans, not mutants in the way that an ordinary human exposed to warp radiation or chaotic mutation becomes a mutant not deformed at random, not corrupted in ways that suggest spiritual taint. They are purpose-bred mutant humans, their mutations cultivated deliberately over generations to produce a specific and extraordinarily useful capability, the ability to perceive the psychic currents of the warp and navigate through them reliably. The physical expression of this capability is the Navigator's third eye located in the center of the forehead, concealed beneath a headband or a helmet in most social situations, and capable, when opened, of perceiving the warp directly, which is both the source of their navigational ability and an immediate lethal threat to anyone nearby who is not heavily shielded against the warp's corrupting influence. A navigator who opens their third eye in an unshielded space causes madness, hemorrhage, and death in those around them, simply from the direct exposure of ordinary minds to the warp's full psychic reality. The Navigator houses are ancient. Some of them trace their lineage back to before the Great Crusade, to the period of Terran history known as the Age of Strife, when humanity's interstellar civilization had fractured and the various human worlds were cut off from each other by the turbulent warp storms that dominated that era. The Navigator families that survived that period did so because their mutation gave them the ability to guide ships through conditions that killed ordinary crews. And the families that could navigate became extraordinarily valuable in a civilization where the ability to travel between stars was the difference between survival and isolation. By the time the Emperor rose and began reuniting the human worlds, the Navigator houses were already entrenched as a political power structure of considerable sophistication. The Emperor needed them. His Great Crusade required a navigational capacity that depended entirely on Navigator families, providing their mutant members to serve aboard Imperial ships. The Navigators needed the Emperor, or at least needed the political stability he offered, and the markets for their services that his expanding Imperium represented. The arrangement between the Emperor and the Navis Nobilite was not negotiated from a position of mutual desperation. It was negotiated from a position in which both parties understood that the other was not going away, and that the terms would need to accommodate that reality. The Navigator houses got their formal recognition, their protected status as legitimate mutants within an Imperium that generally viewed mutation with suspicion at best and extermination at worst, their significant degree of institutional autonomy, and their monopoly on warp navigation. The Emperor got the navigational capacity his fleet required, and the arrangement has held, more or less, for 10,000 years since. But the Navigators knew about the Webway project. Not because the Emperor told them he did not, but because the Navi's Nobilite maintains its own intelligence networks of considerable reach, and the construction activity in the Imperial Palace dungeons was, despite the Emperor's best precautions, not entirely invisible to parties who had both the motivation and the resources to look carefully. The Paternova, the supreme leader of the Navigator houses, understood that something being built under the Imperial Palace had the potential to threaten everything the Navigator monopoly was built on. And so, they sent an agent to destroy the prototype device called Dark Glass, one of the critical components of the webway expansion mechanism, before it could demonstrate its viability. This act of sabotage against the Emperor's personal project, by an institution that officially owed him complete loyalty, is one of the quietly extraordinary details buried in the Webway project's lore. The Navigators, understanding that their entire civilization was built on a monopoly that the Emperor was trying to make obsolete, chose active interference rather than petition or negotiation. And the Emperor, despite his intelligence capabilities and his extraordinary psychic perception, either did not detect the sabotage in time to prevent it, or calculated that the cost of openly confronting the Navigator houses over it exceeded what he was willing to pay at that particular moment in the Great Crusade. In the 41st millennium, the Navigator houses remain. The Webway project failed. The Astronomicon requires its 1,000 psychers a day to keep burning. The ships still need navigators. And the Navis Nobilite's position, which was threatened 10,000 years ago by a project that never came to fruition, is now as secure as it has ever been secured, partly by the failure of the only serious alternative, a failure that at least one of their agents had a hand in ensuring. Whether anyone in the Imperium's current leadership knows this or suspects, it is not something the lore makes clear. The records of the sabotage exist somewhere, presumably, in whatever archive the Emperor's own intelligence apparatus maintained. Whether those records survived the heresy, whether they are accessible to anyone currently in a position to act on them, whether the novice Nobilite has expended resources over 10,000 years, making sure they are not accessible, none of this is documented. What is documented is the simple fact that the Navigators are still there, still essential, still the monopoly holders, on a capability that the entire Imperium depends on, and that the project that would have ended that monopoly never succeeded. Some facts do not require elaborate explanation. They simply require someone to look at them clearly for long enough to understand what they mean. That understanding patient, unhurried, willing to sit in the dark with what is complicated and refuse to accept the simplified version is what makes this universe worth the time it takes to know it properly. And it is what has kept you here tonight, through all of it. The secrets, the depths, the weights of 10,000 years of history, pressing down on the 41st millennium's desperate present. Thank you for bringing that patience with you. It is the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile.